So I'd like to welcome members and viewers who may be watching our proceedings on Oireachtas TV. This is the 17th public session of the joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action. And before I introduce our witnesses today, at the request of the broadcasting unit, can you all please turn off your mobile phones or to put them onto flight mode. I'd like to extend, on behalf of the committee, a very warm welcome to Dr Paul McGowan, who is the chairperson for the Commission for Regulation of Utilities, CREW, and Commissioner Aoife McEvely, Commissioner Garrett Blaney, and John Melvin, Director of Energy Markets. So before we commence, I just want to read out some formalities. I wish to advise the witnesses that by virtue of Section 17(2)(1) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in relation to their evidence to this committee. If you're directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you're entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You're directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you're asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise or make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her or it identifiable. Finally, members are reminded of the long-standing ruling of the Chair to the effect that the member should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside of the House or an official by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So I'll now call on Dr McGowan to make an opening presentation, and I understand, Commissioner McEvely, you'll deal with the issue of smart metering. Is that correct? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Very pleased to appear in front of the committee today. I'm going to give a brief introduction to our strategic plan. I'm going to talk about specific initiatives that we feel are relevant to your agenda in respect of climate change, and then we have also a specific number of slides on smart metering, which I understand are of particular interest to the committee as well. So I'm not going to spend too long on the next few slides. We have just recently completed drafting our new strategic plan for the period 2019 to 2021, and we've initiated the formal process to actually have that plan laid before the Houses of the Oireachtas and published. But what I do want to note is that we have, while keeping our mission pretty much unchanged, we have put climate change at the heart of our strategic plan and our vision for the future. And specifically, we have identified our vision of a sustainable, reliable and efficient future for energy and water, and a secure, low-carbon future. That's a big step and change for us. And I suppose what it shows, and it follows on from some of the recommendations we had from the OECD, is that we do intend to step forward and demonstrate leadership in this area. This is incredibly sensitive. Now, again, I won't spend too long on this, but we have identified 4 strategic priorities for the next 3 years, and perhaps just to underline the first one in particular, and that is to deliver sustainable low-carbon solutions with well-regulated markets and networks. And then alongside those, we are going to place a big emphasis on compliance and accountability, on communications, particularly in supporting customers as they transition, and also in terms of fostering and maintaining a high-performance culture within our own organisation in order that we can deliver on our mandate. I won't spend any time on this, but other than I think this slide demonstrates the range and depth of entities that we actually deal with, whether directly regulating under licence or through contract. So then, to move on then to particular emphasis on a low-carbon future and how we, the CRU, will contribute to that. First area I want to talk about is connection. We are in the process of delivering an enduring connection policy following on from a significant period of time when we were operating what was called Gate 3, the previous batch processing of connections. And that meant that there were no connections being processed for a long period of time. We are now looking to change that and introduce regular batch processing of connections. So our first batch, ECP1, has already been initiated, and that is directly to facilitate 2020 targets. We're also looking now at our second batch, ECP2, and we will be working with the department to ensure that that batch of connections facilitates the new renewable energy support scheme. In addition to that, we are now taking an active interest in the whole area of renewable gas, both in terms of how that might connect to the system and the future role of gas, and also how that can be done safely. In relation to networks, we undertake 5-year price controls for gas and electricity networks. There's nothing new in that, but they are the key enabler for the delivery of infrastructure. And of course, a low-carbon future will rely very heavily on infrastructure in order to deliver the outcomes that are sought. We also are working in relation to interconnectors, which are another area which is key to the integration of renewables onto the system. And the 3 interconnectors that I would particularly note here would be the North-South interconnector, which links Northern Ireland and the Republic. But also we have 2 international interconnectors which we are currently dealing with, and they are the Celtic interconnector linking Ireland with France and the Green Link interconnector linking Ireland with Great Britain. We are also actively engaged now in how gas and electricity might be integrated into the transport and heating sectors. Obviously, the electrification of transport relies on networks in order to deliver that power. And similarly, to the extent that gas is being used, for example, to help decarbonise transport, such as the use of CNG in place of diesel, that obviously requires working with both the network developers and the actual CNG station developers as well. On water, through our network price controls, we will be looking to support Irish Water in making the necessary investments to ensure that the water and wastewater infrastructure in Ireland is resilient, that it promotes conservation, and that it also is capable of adapting to climate change. And those are the extremes both of rain and also drought. I'll get this right at some stage. On wholesale markets, probably worth noting that at this point in time, particularly in relation to electricity, there are now 3 significant revenue streams in the electricity market, wholesale market. They are energy, capacity and ancillary services. The recent completion of the integrated SEM project and the launch on the 1st of October of the new single electricity market now supports flexible units and the rollout of renewable technology. It also supports the introduction of flexible demand and storage onto the electricity system. And it also has demonstrated to be showing that we are now getting a more efficient, in fact a highly efficient use of the existing interconnectors that exist between the island of Ireland and the GB, the Moyle interconnector and the East-West interconnector. The DS3 programme, which is well advanced and is actually quite groundbreaking in its ambitions, is designed to accommodate higher levels of renewables on the system. We're currently at a situation where we can accommodate up to 65% of renewables on the system at any point in time and still maintain security. The target is to get to 75% by 2020. But it's also worth noting that as recently as last Friday, during the night, 73% of the demand on this island was being met by electricity from renewable resources, and that was facilitated because we were able to export that amount of electricity above the 65% over the interconnectors to GB. And that just demonstrates, first of all, the benefits that are being derived from DS3, but also the role of interconnectors in delivering those benefits. We also welcome the significant progress and the political agreement that seems to have been reached in relation to the Clean Energy for All European Citizens package, and we very much look forward to working to implement the changes that will come about as a result of that. I'm now going to hand over to Commissioner McEvely, who's going to talk about retail markets and smart metering.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. McGann.
Thank you. So it is an ambition of national and EU energy policy to put customers and citizens at the heart of the transition to low carbon future. And I think it was also an emphasis that the Citizens' Assembly placed on finding ways to encourage customers to reach out to customers and bring them with us on this journey. So we see the CRU as having a role in our regulation of retail markets, in particular in our role in the smart metering project, project in assisting in that and really putting customers at the heart of everything we do. Our focus in our strategy is to protect and empower customers. So that means ensuring that they have the right tools, the right information and the right choices so that they can benefit from the transition. That means enabling customers to benefit from competition and the types of new technologies that we think will come in under smart metering and smart homes. It means supporting customers to actively engage in energy markets so that they can be what we call prosumers or involved in microgeneration, or they can switch some of their energy consumption so that they can avail of cheaper tariffs at certain times, or avail of different technologies that will help them lower their own bills and assist in the decarbonisation agenda. And our smart metering project is really a facilitating project which will enable a lot of this to happen. And we believe it will have benefits for both customers, for the economy and for the decarbonisation agenda. So it's one of those rare win-win-win projects if we get this right. So a little bit on the smart metering project. We have been working with the department, with ESB Networks that's going to roll out the electricity meters, and with the entire supply industry in Ireland to try and ensure that we have the right conditions to make this work and to make this work to the benefit of customers. The types of benefits we hope to see, obviously, as I said, empowering customers, so giving them better information, better choices, enabling them and incentivising them to avail of energy efficiency options, giving them better price information, better information about their consumption, and encouraging them to avail of energy efficiency options. Facilitating renewables. So again, as we talked about, the ability to have more renewables on the network and to make the best use of those renewables is really important to us, and it would be great if customers could get the benefit of that. So one of the really interesting features from the wholesale market redesign is that we can really see now, when we have a lot of wind on the system, the wholesale price comes down. It will be wonderful to enable customers, domestic customers, to avail of those lower prices at certain times. And that will take better information through smart meters, in some cases smart home technology to help them to do this without having to constantly decide when they're going to turn their immersion on or off, and enable smart products to come through from suppliers, and we see this as the way forward. And it enables ESB networks to do things in a smarter way. Think about, well, where do we need to invest in the grid? Where can we be more efficient? How can we support, for instance, if we're going to electrify transport and heating on a mass scale, how can we do that at least cost and make better investment decisions? So it's a real enabler of all of those options. When we looked at this project, I mean, it is a massive project. The costs are over €1 billion, in the order of 1.1 billion. We also had to weigh up again, the benefits that we see, and we did conduct a major smart metering trial. Now, in some ways, the data is outdated. We were looking at very simple applications for customers, but we did find that customers could save up to 10% on their bills through simply having better information about how they use their electricity in their home. Simply understanding that a bit better, they could reduce their consumption. And then having a time of use tariff, which enabled them to move some of their high energy consumption usage, like, turning the washing machine on or the dishwasher on, just at a low cost time of the evening, let's say, rather than doing it at peak. And of course, the benefit that has then to the electricity system, if that's taken up on large scale, is we might avoid having to build additional generators to meet peak demand. When we were looking at some of the peak demand events over the last few weeks, because obviously we're in winter, this is where we are now, we saw quite high prices because we were bringing on old and often very carbon inefficient peaking units to meet that very high peak in the winter. Wouldn't it be great if we could just avoid that and have customers pay less money by using their electricity off peak where they have that choice? So those are the kind of benefits that we see. And of course, just offering a better service to customers. No more estimated bills. You may know we have a customer care team in CRU that deals with customers who are having problems with their suppliers, and that is one of the most intractable intractable problems perennially. A customer thinks they've been paying their bill and discovered that over a period of years it's been an estimated bill and they have a large catch-up bill, and that is a very difficult problem to resolve. And smart meters will help do that by having more up-to-date information for customers and avoid that. And as I mentioned, avoided costs of manual meter reads, avoided costs hopefully of network investment. So there are a lot of areas that we can really gain from this project. And then the slide that just sets out phase one, effectively, of our project, which is commencing this year. So ESB networks are in the process of finalising procurement at the moment. This is a major project, so obviously we have to buy the meters, we have to install the meters, and then there is a huge IT project around the availability of the data from those meters. So ESB Networks has to update its central IT systems, and then every supplier active in the market also has to update their IT systems. We're going to go from, for each customer, getting effectively 4 meter reads a year, so 4 pieces of data for every customer in Ireland to tell them about their consumption and how they're going to be billed. We're going to go from that to potentially having much more rich data available, so a lot of IT upgrades needed. So what we're doing in the phased approach is over 2019 and 2020, we're rolling out the first 250,000 meters. So these are ESBN meters. It's an ESBN metering replacement programme, effectively upgrading the meters from what we have at the moment. And then that IT project working along, it's ongoing at the moment, and by January of 2021 we'll be able to go live with the smart services, so the meters that are in homes that have the capability of transmitting that richer data set will be live, and suppliers can start offering different services to customers based on that. And then over the following 2 phases we'll be rolling out more meters so that ultimately it will become a national replacement project. By 2024 we should have significant penetration of these meters in effectively all homes and all SME businesses in Ireland, and we'll have the full functionality of the meters and the data. So that is the plan, and we're well underway on that. I think that's
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I'm going to go to our slots. We're going to keep it to 5 minutes. I have Deputy Sherlock, Deputy Heydon, Deputy Ryan and Deputy Butler. Deputy Sherlock.
Thank you, Chair, and I welcome you to the committee today. I want to talk about community-owned energy projects or community initiatives. Why is it taking so long for community energy projects or community energy initiatives? Why is it taking so long for those projects to get connections to the grid? I'm hearing stories of projects waiting 7 to 10 years. And why is it that you haven't sorted this out up to now? First question.
Okay. So I suppose I'll hand over to John for particular details, but that really comes down to the connection policy. And there was a period of time when the focus was on connecting a large volume of wind in order to meet the 2020 targets for renewable energy. And that essentially led to a situation where a queue began to accumulate of various projects, whether they were solar, small scale, large scale. We had offshore wind and lots of different projects getting into that queue. We've changed our approach now to connections, and we've introduced a regular batch system. And the purpose of that is actually to start bringing forward a lot of the projects that will fit with the renewable energy support scheme that the government are actually initiating. So if the government in the RES place an emphasis on community projects, then in our connection policy we will be placing an emphasis on community projects in order to try and match the support scheme with the connections. So yes, we acknowledge there has been delays in connecting projects heretofore, but we have now adopted a different approach to connections.
So if a community energy project comes into being, we'll say, within the next 6 months, for instance, you know, how long will it take them reasonably to get onto the grid, in light of what you've just said?
Yeah, so essentially the previous system was one large batch, maybe 3,000 to 4,000 megawatts of connections, and that took many years to build. The current approach is that every 2 years or so there'll be a smaller batch which will be able to be developed, offers made and built, so that every 2 years, and the timing of those would be lined up with the various government policies, such as the renewable the RES scheme, the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme, so that the timings of the offers will coincide with the schemes that are there to support them, and if those RES auctions are every 2 years, then the batches will be designed to match that, so that all the different arms of policy are lined up. So if the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme has auctions every couple of years, then essentially the batches for the connections will be timed to align with that every couple of years.
So, but if you were giving me a real-time analysis of what's happening at the moment, like what you're saying is arguably theoretical, if I understand you correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong. You're saying that if the scheme, the RES scheme, is the RES scheme live now, and what is the expectation for, say, a community energy project in rural Cork, for instance,
Okay, so
if they were starting tomorrow?
The RES scheme is due to go live in 2019. I think that's the government's target, but obviously that's not within our bailiwick, so I can't be definitive on that, but that's our understanding. I suppose it's important to say that if the RES scheme prioritises community projects, our connection policy will prioritise community projects.
Okay, so
it is
it's
dependent
pieces in the jigsaw here, so what you're telling me.
The RES scheme is the means by which the different renewable schemes are actually going to achieve a revenue stream, an assurance of a revenue stream, and that is the base on which they're going to be able to finance their projects. So without a RES, it's highly unlikely that a lot of these schemes would come forward for connection.
Okay, but assuming they do under RES,
Yeah.
you will then regulate those schemes?
We don't regulate the scheme. What we do is we regulate the availability of connections for those schemes.
Yeah. Okay. The point of my intervention is that if you're talking a lot here about the front end of what the consumer will see in relation to, or what choices they will have in relation to energy supply into their individual home. That's fine, that's wonderful, and I've had some briefing from ESB in respect of smart metering, okay? But I want to go to the back end of this, and if we're going to encourage the move towards renewables, I think what we need to hear from CRU is how you are going to unlock the regulatory burdens for community energy projects to get onto the grid, you know, the smart grid as you so call it, and incentivise people to actually start producing electricity themselves, if you will.
So the incentive to produce the electricity will come from the Renewable Energy Support Scheme, okay. But if those schemes are identified and are being supported through that scheme, then we will be ensuring that the connection policy will deliver the connections to give effect to that policy.
And so if everything fits into place, my last intervention, Chair, are you saying that you can then, you know, reduce that timeline down from 7 to 10 years to what? What is a reasonable expectation?
I can't be definitive in fairness, but what I can
Give
say,
me
we're talking
range.
a small number of years, because as often as the RES changes, we will try to be ensuring that the connection policy keeps pace with that.
Okay. Again, the logic of my intervention is based on the Scottish model. You have 500 megawatts now being generated. It's about 5% of renewable capacity in Scotland, and they've hit that target. So there were specific targets, and that's why I think if we can translate a Scottish model into an Irish context, I think we'd be doing a good day's work.
But if you take ECP1 as an example, we decided there to prioritise DS3 to get projects on the wires, for example batteries, in order to support DS3. And what we now have is a series of 2,000 odd megawatts of connection offers out there now supporting the likes of batteries, wind, solar, in order to meet that policy priority. The next batch will look at the next policy priority, and like I say, if that includes community schemes under the RES, then the connection policy will meet that policy led.
Thank you.
I'm going to move to Deputy Martin Heydon. You have 5 minutes.
Thanks, Chair, and thank the officials coming in for the presentations. I'm going to try and avoid duplication, so I'll leave aside points I was going to make around community ownership and smart meters, because you covered them extensively in your presentation as well. In the area of microgeneration, the Citizens' Assembly recommended that the selling back into the grid of electricity from microgeneration by private citizens at a price which is at least equivalent to the wholesale price. Incoming EU legislation in the form of the recast EU Renewable Energy Directive will usher in some of this, introducing elements to generate, store and sell renewable electricity for renewable self-consumers in Ireland. I suppose the 3 questions I just wanted to put to you on that one was, What do you see the challenges to microgeneration, storage, self-consumption and export into the grid in Ireland, and how can and will we overcome these? How far away are we from getting a tariff for selling electricity back to the grid? And if you consider the area of farmers, in particular, many of them are looking to produce and sell renewable energy as a part of their business model into the future, using the likes of rooftop spaces or for solar or for a variety of different things. When will they be able to produce and export to the grid, do you think? So that's the first question. In that area, if you want to take that first.
Sure, thank you. Yes, so again, this is the kind of option that the smart meters will facilitate finally. So the smart meters will be able to record how much electricity is being exported, which just isn't possible through the current metering system. And suppliers will be able to receive that data, and because the smart meters also match the supplier and the customer's home with the wholesale market, they'll be able to link with that half-hourly price on the wholesale market. So we'll be able to see the pattern of when that electricity was exported, how much, what the price was effectively at that period, and we can just feed through that price. Now, the smart meters are the enablers. There may be other things that we'll need to do from sort of market messages or market methods to enable suppliers to offer that, but we're happy to work on that because we know there's a real appetite, and we know it's part of the Citizens' Assembly agenda, and we think there's real benefits out there. I suppose it is worth saying that, you know, probably for most customers in a domestic setting that invest in solar PV, a majority of the benefit will be that it avoids them using electricity themselves. I'm not sure how much the value of it will be in terms of what they're exporting, but I think just from an equity point of view, the idea that they do receive that wholesale price is you know, I think it's something that we'll be working towards.
Yeah, I think it's a very important principle. In the area of renewable energy, look, we heard from EirGrid about their ambition to get to a level of 75% of renewable generation in the system at a time by 2020, and that Ireland currently is at world-leading 65%, and it's great to see Ireland showing leadership in this area, but what are the impacts of having huge levels of intermittent renewables on the grid, and how are you, EirGrid, ESB networks, planning for a more stable generation that would underpin this? That will obviously be necessary as well. And then in the area of offshore, we know that Ireland has enormous potential for generation of renewable energy off our coasts. What are the obstacles to development of a successful offshore renewable energy industry, and how can they be overcome, and how are you looking at this in that area of renewables?
Okay, I'll start, but I'm going to pass over to John to pick up on that. I think it is widely acknowledged that the DS3 programme and the delivery of 75% is groundbreaking internationally, and a lot of people are actually looking at what we're achieving here. I think the reality is we're now at 65%, and security of supply has been shown to be maintained. So we have demonstrated that the system can cope with 65%, and clearly the introduction of 70 and then 75% will be subject to a trial before it actually becomes a transmission policy in terms of operating the system. But it is going to require quite a radical change in some aspects of the market, of the generation portfolio. For example, one of the key things that we're looking at now is the role of batteries, or fast-acting storage and discharge devices. But batteries seem to be the predominant technology in that area. And DS3 is now delivering competitive auctions to actually bring that type of technology forward onto the system. And next year we'll be running the first auction to deliver between 90 and 110 megawatts of that type of technology. And this is the sort of technology that we need to start to see coming forward onto the system in order to deliver those sorts of levels of renewables penetration on the system while maintaining security.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I can add much to that other than this DS3 programme was designed to say, here are the services that the grid needs to see in order to be secure whilst having large amounts of intermittent renewables. The wind may or may not stop blowing, and to have reserves ready there at hand, ready to react quickly. The frequency on the grid can change when there's a lot of renewables on. So to say specifically, here's a product that will keep that the grid, the frequency stable. So essentially, we have seen that evolve over time. We are purchasing the amount of these services that are required as the level of intermittent renewables go up. And as Paul said, a lot of the existing generators have modified and changed their equipment. At one time, the key focus for generation was efficiency, burn less fossil fuels for more electrons. And in the recent past, because of these signals, it makes sense for generators to have flexibility, to be able to respond quickly, as well as efficiency, because that flexibility allows the greater levels of grid on. And other ways to support the more traditional type of generation is the capacity mechanisms make payments to generators for being present on the system and available to the system. And as more and more renewables comes on, the actual energy price declines. So there's no margin at 0 pence. So why would those generators stay? So to answer that question, there are two other parts. One is we will pay you for creating these services that allow that much renewables onto the system, and then we will pay a support or a price for actually having generators on this island that are useful to us. So I think that's essentially how we can allow that to develop and be supported.
And, yeah, just mention on the offshore technology. Like, there's been a significant reduction in cost of offshore across Europe, so we've seen a fairly major change, mainly as a result of auctions. And so the new RES process is an auction-based process, so it's been driving down the cost of offshore. I think from our point of view, and I think as my colleagues have explained before, we will follow whatever is in the RES system and try and facilitate that. It's a matter for the Minister and the Department then of how they want to design that. We're happy to input that and give it further information. But if there is offshore as part of that, we'll look at sort of efficient integration of offshore into the system.
Very good. Chair, could I just ask one final question?
Very briefly.
Just on the area of carbon tax, the UK has introduced a price floor for carbon in the electricity sector of £18 per tonne of CO2. Has this been looked at in an Irish context for the ETS sector? And how would CRU view this? And also, Ireland's Climate Change Advisory Council has recommended a long-term price be set for carbon of €80 per tonne by 2030, and that any increase in carbon taxation should be accompanied by measures to address energy poverty and reduce the negative impacts of carbon taxation on poor households. How could this be implemented, in your view, in a way that wouldn't negatively affect the fuel poor or those in rural areas? And, you know, obviously, we've had the whole process with water charges. It's really important that, however we do this, we bring people with us. Do you think there's lessons we can learn from all of that?
Thank you, Deputy.
Deputy, you're definitely straying into the territory of government policy, which obviously we have no role in. What I would say is that whether it's a price floor or whatever, it is going to have an impact on the wholesale energy price in the market. So I suppose the key thing, what we have always said, is that our role is to ensure that the cost of energy is as low as it can be. Now, not cheap, but as low as it can be, taking account of the need for security, sustainability and so forth. It very much is a matter for government policy as to how the impacts of those charges are dealt with at a societal level. But I would absolutely agree with you that one of the things that we've noted in terms of any of the major changes that we're looking at introducing, that is, people have to want to go on this journey with, whether it's the energy retailer or the generator or whoever it is. So people need to accept the electricity or the gas infrastructure in their community. They need to accept the generation technology. They need to accept the smart meter into their home if this journey is going to be a successful one.
Thank you. Deputy Ryan, you have 5 minutes.
Very much indeed. I think the political message to you as regulators is going to be to put increased attention on the whole emissions reduction. To be honest, while the energy sector has done more than agriculture and transport, which have done absolutely nothing, the reality is we're still dependent on 90% fossil fuels for our energy mix. That has to change. Renewables is only 9.3%. That's going to lead to significant costs to the Irish Exchequer. Emissions last year only marginally went down because of a mild winter and because Moneypoint was out of action for a while. We need to scale up our ambition, and I'm fearful that we don't still get that across the state. Can I ask a couple of just very direct questions? When will the auction be next year?
John, the RES auction, I presume you're talking
Yes, sorry, the new connection auction.
Yeah, so the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme auction will be is run by the department, and it's expected in 2019.
Any idea when?
the latter half. That's
That's
I
our
can't be more
understanding.
It's very
definitive
important
than that
in
at
terms
this
of
point.
timing meeting our 2020 targets, which I'll agree that that's earlier in the year rather than later to be able to do that.
I think it's the latter half.
Oh no, well, I understand it's in the latter half of the year, but it's under the auspices of the department as opposed to ourselves.
Can I ask a question? Money Point, I believe, has been out of action for 2 or 3 months now, and as you say in your earlier discussion, we're able, with our exporting capability, our interconnection capability, we're able to run our system. Could we not, on the security basis, shut down our peat and coal-fired power stations and manage the country with renewables, gas and interconnection?
I think maybe that's a long-term vision rather than something we would do overnight. I mean, Money Point has been down, but we've had really good wind. We've had good interconnection. Neither of the interconnectors were down, and peat has been part of the fuel mix. So if they were all to go overnight, I don't think any of us would be as comfortable around security of supply. But I do think we should start planning in that direction. It is worth saying the PSO ends shortly, so by 2019 and early 2020 that PSO will be gone. So 100% peat burning should be no more in this country.
But between the two, those coal and peat, they must account for how much of our emissions totally? But must be about 8 or 9%, isn't it, of our national emissions?
Yeah, I don't have the emissions numbers, but yet they would be the most significant emitters.
Those recent months, we've been pretty much exporting all the time. We have that slight buffer, if we really needed to, that we could start importing more.
Yeah, but we wouldn't be able to take as much wind onto the system as well. So you might win on one side and lose on another. I'm not saying it's not possible, but we also want to make sure the lights don't go out as we transition, and that's part of bringing people with us too. And I do think what you're talking about, maybe it's more medium term rather than long term, but it would need to be planned.
Okay. Can I ask, if the government came to you, or the Oireachtas recommended that we would initiate a mechanism where supermarket car parks, public car parks, offices were mandated to provide a certain percentage of electric charging points. I know the ESB have just got this money from the government in terms of from fast chargers on motorways, but if we came up with a recommendation saying mandate public car parks to have a certain percentage fast charging EV connection points, would that fit in within the new structures that you've put in place in terms of how EV charging networks should work?
ESB networks would roll out.
Yeah, I mean, I would expect that would be part of the vision for the electrification of transport. I mean, in the longer term, if 9 out of 10 people have an electric vehicle and they all arrive home at the same time and all charge at the same time, so local distribution issues might arise. But we supported ESB networks in a trial to understand the impacts of electric vehicle charging and electric vehicle infrastructure. So the Irish DSO has a head start, so to speak, or a head start in understanding those impacts. So yes, that is absolutely something that could be dealt with or handled in the current structures.
Great. I would just take out the word long run in your answer there. I suppose the point I'm making is we need to turn the long run into the short run. And we need to invest ahead of demand in this area, in my mind. We need to take some bets around infrastructure investment to turn the long run into the short run. Last question, if I can, Chair. And maybe Mr. Blaney would be the best place to ask this as the future Data Communications Commissioner. I'm very supportive of the Smart Metering project. As you know, in our other committee, we've been screaming for this for years. Who will own the data?
So, I mean, this is a really interesting point in terms of the legislation. As it stands at the moment, we need to make sure we comply with all the European legislation, particularly GDPR. And I know my colleagues have been in discussion with the Data Commissioner. So it's very important that the consumers have confidence in the smart meter, that the smart meter is, that they have control on their data and it's not being used for, in purposes that they wouldn't wish it to be used for. So I think, I'm not sure it's necessarily a telecoms dimension, but certainly there's, between the Data Commissioner and between the rights that are set in process with ESB networks, we're confident that there won't be misuse of that data and the data protection is built in. If I don't know if you wanted to add any more on that.
Yeah, I agree, Garrett, and I suppose ultimately it is the customer that owns the data. It is, if you take what might be very granular data, like the half-hourly data, I think the Data Protection Commissioner and ourselves would view that as personal data, so GDPR does apply. On the other hand, we all get data comes from our meters already, and it's necessary for billing. So we want to try and make sure we get the right balance between still being able to extract a level of data from the meters to enable billing and better information to customers, but nothing that would be construed as personal data without the customer's opt-in acceptance of that. And then if they do allow it to be given to ESB networks or their supplier, that the supplier doesn't have the right to simply pass that on, the customer has the rights all the time. That's really important.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Deputy. I'm going to bring in Deputy Mary Butler.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your submissions here today. I welcome the approach of putting customers at the heart of the process, which will be available who will be able to avail of different technology that will lower bills. Better price information is absolutely key, better education, I suppose, on this. So my question is, how do you propose to do this going forward to educate people about these smart meters? And I'll just continue. You spoke there about the smart meter and that it will be a national replacement programme over the next many years. So can I just confirm that there won't be a price to the consumer, the customer, in relation to the smart meter itself? And my next question in relation to smart meters, which was partially answered, can I presume then the smart meter will feed into a central database and provide up-to-the-minute data for the CRU and other organisations? Now, I know you partially answered that in relation to GDPR, but if you could just tease out that a little bit, please.
I might ask John to answer some of those questions. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So in terms of the information from the meters will be transmitted through telecommunications infrastructure to ESB networks, who are the distribution system operator. So they will hold that information. The information will be pulled a number of times a day back to ESB networks. And this all assumes that the customer has opted in and allowed the information to travel on that basis. That will record the consumption every half hour. That information can be is then passed on to the supplier of that customer. So CRU won't be getting necessarily ourselves this on a minute-to-minute basis. In terms of is there a cost for the installation of, will the customer see a bill for the installation of a smart meter? The answer is no, they won't. Okay. However, the meters do cost money. There's already a meter there, and the paying down of the cost of that and the maintenance of that is inbuilt into the distribution system tariffs that form part of your retail bill. So no one will come and say, there's your meter, there's your bill for the meter. It'll be, there's your new meter, and you've either opted in and the data will flow, or you haven't, and only the standard amount of data will come. So in terms of getting that price information to the consumer, there are lots of different methodologies and mechanisms out there. For example, the price, the half-hourly price will be it's available on a website today. So, for example, one of the ways in which this might work might be, and this is just one way, an app in your home that is connected to the internet that knows the price in this half hour and essentially says, I will turn on the immersion now because the price is very low and the hot water will be there when XYZ comes home. So these sort of decisions can be made without human intervention, and when we did the customer behaviour trial, essentially as Aoife said, the technology was not that sophisticated, and it required customers to decide themselves, I won't turn on the dishwasher until after 7, I won't turn on the washing machine until after 7, or I'll get this piece of work finished before 5 if you were home before 5. And even that level of human intervention required allowed people to shift nearly 9% of the peak most expensive consumption out of that area. So even in the very simple information, which was just 5 to 7 is expensive, see can you move things out yourself. people who participated in that were able to move stuff away from the more expensive periods into the cheaper periods. And also by virtue of knowing, for example, they could see their information over the last week. They can see, well, the immersion must have been on all day and no one was here. Small things like that, the provision of that information into the home, which maybe through the Internet of Things in the future in a more sophisticated way, allow people to just cut their overall consumption by around 3%. So lots of ways where it can get into...
So just to clarify, do you propose a national kind of a rollout of an information for the consumer? Because a lot of people will be availing of these smart meters, won't understand them. And can you just clarify again there, you said people will have the opportunity to opt in if they want to share their data, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so I think we very much recognise, and I should have mentioned it during the presentation, just how important it is to explain this to customers and bring them with us, absolutely. So one of the key areas that we're working on at the moment with ESB networks and with suppliers is a communication strategy. So the way that this will, I suppose, come to customers is we're starting to roll out the meters in 2019, but the smart services won't be available until 2021. So we realise there's a bit of a gap there.
Yeah.
So we're not going to go out with a very big singing and dancing, national advertising campaign about smart meters when really they won't be very smart for 2 years. So it'll be a bit more about informing customers, making sure there's information available to address any concerns they have in advance of the meters going in their areas. And then as we get to the point where the smart services are turned on, stepping up the information campaign so customers can understand, right, I have a smart meter or I want a smart meter, and here's how I can benefit from that, here's how I can avail of one, here's the the offers that are available from my supplier. So there'll be a lot more coming down the track then as we move through the phases of rollout. But that is absolutely core, and thank you for giving me the
Just
opportunity.
a final question, I'll be very brief. So just for the next 2 years, people will just assume that there is a national replacement programme of their current meter, and then the information will follow in due course.
Exactly. That couldn't have summarised it better.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Deputy.
Chair.
Deputy Lahart, do you want to go?
I'll be really brief. What are the utilities? Can you name the utilities you regulate?
Yeah, we have a list of them on the screen. But so on the gas side, we regulate Gas Networks Ireland. On the electricity side, we regulate ESB Networks, Airgrid, and on the water, we regulate Irish Water. So they're the four utilities per se that we regulate. And then, of course, any person who sells electricity or gas to final customers, they hold a licence from us as well. So we regulate them.
Okay, yeah. No, the reason I ask is, so I represent Dublin South West, and it's in the county of South Dublin. Okay, and there's a social housing stock of about 10,000 houses there, and so that would be replicated in every local authority. The numbers would be different. Mm-hmm. Is it open from a regulatory point of view for? Because those 10,000 homes would be 10,000 individual customers, mm-hmm, with different accounts across the utility companies. That's right. Is it open for, because I think there would be so many advantages in this, for a local authority to organise a best deal system for its, in my case, 10,000 social housing tenants? Because if it is, then obviously there's a huge amount of, there's quite a substantial housing stock. A lot of the things that you're talking about, I know that you're talking about rolling out the smart metering, but a lot of the innovative solutions that are offered at the moment by some of the companies are quite pricey. There may be savings, there are very definitely savings over the medium term, never mind the long term, but they are aimed at middle class, middle income people who can afford it. And I'm thinking about those who can't afford these kind of measures. If a local authority could purchase bundles from utility companies, then it puts them in charge of, in a much better way, without controlling the entire thing, of securing deals, of reducing energy costs, of monitoring all of those energy costs, of looking at, because obviously retrofitting is often the way that we look at most, but there's a huge cost to that. So I don't know if that has come up before or whether the Commission has a view on that. In other words, if South Dublin County Council decided, actually we think it would be in the best interests of our customers that we'll look after the supply of electricity to those 10,000 homes, we'll get the best deal from whether it's ESB or Energia, we'll renegotiate from time to time, but we're also going to start ensuring that that our tenants are as well educated as possible in terms of energy use, etc. Yeah.
Just very briefly, yeah. First of all, I think one of the really good things is all new homes will be subject to building regulations which will make them best in class, and many of them, I see them going up in southwest Dublin, and they have solar PV, they have...
They're the new ones.
Yeah.
But you still have a huge 70s and 80s stock. Yeah.
But the new houses will be best in class. We will be asking, as soon as ESB Networks has smart meters procured, all new houses will have smart meters. So in terms of mass buying on behalf of customers, it would be almost like one of the, say the Big Switch campaign, where customers might group together to negotiate a deal that's open to the local council to try and bring customers together and negotiate that. From our point of view, customers will always have a right to switch. So we would just need to make sure that that's available. So if you moved into the house and found you were with a supplier you didn't like, you could switch away, and that it complies with the supplier handbook customer protections. But that would be open to local councils to explore potentially if they wanted to bring those customers together.
Gain in that from, would say, the what we're all at here, the objective is, would you see a gain in that for a bulk buyer? From a carbon footprint point of view, and from a, in other words, if a local authority decided, no, actually, this is something we can do, this is something that we can get involved in. It's not just about the best deals, but it's actually then beginning a process of energy reduction, etc., etc.
I suppose we'd just be clear, the local authority wouldn't be the customer, it would be the individual householders. But look, there's options there. We have quite a number of suppliers that are certified as supplying 100% green electricity. So if people wanted to engage around that, or you'll see a lot of suppliers offering bundles. As you said, smart home bundles are available now, Nest controllers, other smart home technology, if you switch to them. So long as the customer, who is the householder, always has the right to choose, but if you brought them together as a group and said, here's a deal that's really attractive and is green and renewable and offers these other alternatives, that could be facilitated.
But you see, and I want to finish this because this is really important. Things have changed. You're saying the customer, this isn't right, you're wrong here. In fact, I had someone approach me recently who's renting a house, now not from a local authority, and said, can you bring in some rules that actually obligate landlords to introduce best energy technology in their home? Because he said, I'm very much in favour of doing what I can to reduce my carbon footprint, but my landlord controls the heating system in the house. I pay the bill, but I don't control the energy that creates the heat in my house. Okay? So what I'm saying here is very clearly, this is a space that we can look at. If you have a local authority, in the case of South Dublin, that controls, essentially owns 10,000 homes, yes, the customer has a right in terms of maybe what user, but the state owns that house and can actually, there's 10,000 homes where you said they could purchase green energy, exclusively green energy for those homes. Who's going to argue with that? And it may only make a small impact, but it's a significant impact if it became a policy issue. So the customer may be in charge of what supplier, but they're not in charge of the energy. And the constituent I spoke to would love to have had a heat pump, but it's a gas boiler. And he has no control over that because he doesn't own the house. The landlord owns the house. So this is a space I think that we might have to investigate.
Do you have any comment on that? Or?
I'm not sure I could respond in that the whole issue of, I think where you're coming from is the energy efficiency and driving energy efficiency.
Yeah.
I think our role is really to ensure that the cost of that energy is as low as possible, and that the customer ultimately has to, A, the right to choose, and B, to know what they're buying, whether it's green or a mixture of green and non-green energy.
But there's nothing precluding.
But there's
bulk,
nothing precluding, to be absolutely clear, there is nothing precluding anybody from seeking a supply licence from us, provided they meet the essential criteria for that and that they comply with the rules within the market. And that's no more, no less than we would expect from anybody else who wanted to supply.
Move on. Thank you. Thank you. Deputy Neville, and I forgot to say this is the 3-minute slot.
Just thank the witnesses for coming in. The smart technology you're speaking about, how old is that technology? Has it been rolled out in other countries? If so, when was it rolled out? What are the results like? And if so, beforehand, why was it not rolled out in Ireland sooner? Secondly, in relation to data centres, what impact of increased numbers of data centres will be on the grid? With significant future growth projected in this area, who will pay for future maintenance and upgrades of the grid? And how will this impact on electricity consumer bills? And the electrification of heat and transport, how are you looking at ensuring the grid will be able to support the increasing energy demands from the large-scale electrification of heat and transport, i.e. from electrical vehicles and heat pumps, that is needed to help meet Ireland's climate targets?
Thank you. There's a lot of questions there. In any order you wish.
Okay, and I'll perhaps take one or two of those questions at a high level and pass on to some of my colleagues. In terms of the grid and its ability to cope with the future demands, essentially what we do is, through the price control, is we look to the utility to bring forward what they consider to be the necessary investments that they need to put in place in order to meet future demands. And they carry out rigorous exercises around trying to forecast demand, both in optimistic scenarios and pessimistic scenarios, and trying to pitch an infrastructure investment plan which will meet the needs of certainly the next 5 years, and then also looking into the longer term for longer term projects. And we work with them and we determine whether or not it's a reasonable plan, and ultimately our decision on their revenue control will ensure that they have the funds available to make the necessary investments. You've mentioned data centres and their impact on grids. Data centres are clearly a significant driver of demand on the Irish electricity system at the moment and into the near future. They tend to be fairly flat loads. So in terms of feeding a flat load, it tends to be a reasonably efficient load to feed, but nevertheless it raises also the peak as well. So it is going to have an impact on grids, and part of what we're trying to do is ensure that if data centres can locate in parts of the country where there is let's say, more capacity on the grid than in others, then clearly they will have a quicker time to connect to that. And if they do insist on connecting in areas where there is a lack of grid access, then the role there is can they be part of the solution? So can they actually, as part of their development, deliver some of their own energy solutions? But also they have to recognise that in some cases there may be time required in order to roll out the grid to meet their demands. But ultimately, one of our roles is to ensure that the cost of all of this infrastructure is met on a fair and equitable basis across the range of customers. In terms of the rollout of smart technology, I'll hand over to John Arif on that one. I think they've got more up to date.
Yeah, so essentially the technology that's been purchased, it's in towards the end of the purchasing phase at the minute, so it's therefore up to date as of today. Where else, by the end of 2020, it's expected that there'll be in or around 700 million smart meters, largely across Europe and the US. And essentially this is a major infrastructural project that will take a number of years to roll out. And essentially that project we underwent a number of phases in the evaluation of this particular project, which involved statistically relevant customer behaviour trials, a high-level design phase, a detailed level design phase, which last year, I think, or in 2017, we made the decision to roll these out, that the cost-benefit analysis was such that it made sense. And the most cost-effective way to roll that out was the phased approach that Aoife described earlier, where we will do 250,000 starting next year, and once the 250,000 are in, that'll allow time for the communications infrastructure, the backbone of all of this to be put in at or about the same time. So we're up to date today.
Okay.
Yeah.
So 5-year plan. Where will we be in 5 years?
So by the end, sorry,
yeah,
go ahead.
So it's because I have time.
Yeah.
I'm really coughing.
Yeah.
Where will we be in 5 years' time with this?
Yeah. Yeah.
And how much do you envisage that may reduce our carbon footprint?
So by the end of 2024, all of the 2.2 million metres should have been placed. So that would be in every home. Then as customers take this up, opt in and understand the benefits of using less electricity, the ability to use less electricity, the ability to move away from the more expensive electricity, and the ability to use more of the green electricity, then it's as customers take it up, as customers react. What this does is it enables customers to do that. It doesn't mandate
But
anyone.
is there a commercial projection here as to how much carbon will be reduced by putting in this technology, given the statistical analysis you've put into place already?
Yeah, no, in fairness, we haven't done that calculation because we were looking very much at costs and benefits in terms of electricity price reductions and moving away from different types of things. But look, we can have a stab at it maybe and come back.
Can you have a look at that to see? Because you probably have that information.
We probably
if
do.
you look for
Yeah,
a
we just
report.
haven't.
You just have a look for that report.
Yeah.
If you could present that to us, it'd be great.
Yeah, no,
That first. That's great. Thank you. I'm going to move on to who's next on my list. Deputy Mulhern, you're replacing, taking Senator Lombard's place. Okay.
Thanks.
You have 3 minutes, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Okay. I want to welcome the CRU and get straight to the point. I just wanted to, I suppose, inquire about the efficiency of the CRU in granting the various licences, the generation licences, the certificate of high efficiency and that to organisations, individuals who want to generate electricity, get into that field. I want to particularly refer to the Mayo Renewable Project for the 45 megawatt high efficiency combined heat and power plant, which will be biomass fuelled at the Asahi site in Mayo. I know that this project had been on the go for quite some time. From approximately 2006 to 2015, it took it to get all its consents in place, including the certificate of high efficiency at 100%. Then, I suppose, come 2016, they ran into particular difficulty with the boiler, which made some investors pull out. Thankfully, they're now back on track, and they have basically are trying to replicate, their new promoters, they're trying to replicate the exact same project, the same design, the same proposition, etc. There's no material change to it. There are 4 consents it needs, or from 4 different authorities, including yourself. It has succeeded in getting consents from Mayo County Council in relation to the planning permission, the EPA, also ESB networks. In relation to yourselves, an application was made in June for the consents that it requires, and it seems that they're running into an awful lot of difficulty. First of all, the certificate of high efficiency, which was granted at 100% previously, then was given a 70% rating by consultants you retained. I know you've gone back to the drawing board on that because there has been no indication as to where there's a material change in the proposition before you. And they have no idea when the consent is going to come through. It's a 255 million project. 95 million has already been incurred by the investors on this project. It has also strategic national significance in that it will help us achieve our renewable electricity targets and also help towards heating targets. And in relation to the region, it is required for the development of a data centre for which there is planning permission. And it has been pinned, or it has been identified by the County Council, by the IDA, by everybody involved as of strategic importance. And the whole project is in danger of falling flat on its back. If I just conclude, because it basically speaks for itself, of falling flat on its face on account of the various components or moving parts which require investors to know what's going to happen. And I just think it doesn't make sense to me what's going on here. And
Get
I
a
ask,
reply, just because time is running out.
Yes.
Yeah. Get a reply. Yeah, if you want to come in on that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Senator. This is obviously, we have different functions in terms of issuing different licences. We have generation licences, we have supply licences. This is a specific case in terms of the Mayo Power. There's a European directive which is high efficiency CHP Our role is very specific in that what we have to do is take the European legislation and demonstrate that it's definitely a useful heat, and that useful heat is a key part of the high efficiency. Once it gets that useful heat certification, then it can get specific support under the renewable support mechanisms. And obviously there's a much higher amount of money available if you're high efficiency versus low efficiency or normal efficiency. So I think it's fair to say that this is genuinely quite a complicated area. It's quite complicated legislation in terms of the interpretation. There's a lot of thermodynamics of the process. We have to assess that if the project, i.e. the high efficiency CHP, wasn't there, that you would still have done this heat use absent the CHP. That's the sort of a test for us to try and assess it. It took us quite a long time originally when the project itself has sort of questions about, you know, how the fuel, the specifics of biomass fuel. This is the useful heat in this case is drying fuel, so we have to clearly make sure that we're confident that it's properly dried and has a proper use. I mean, it has taken longer than we would like. It took us quite a long time the first time round, and there's a number of legal aspects we're trying to work our way through. We've put quite a lot of activity on it. It's been a priority for us in the organisation. I know I've talked to the county manager on numerous occasions. It's obviously an issue for the county manager and for the county as well. We'll continue to look at it. But you know, there's nothing more I can say. It's still under consideration.
What has changed materially, Garrett, whereby what you were certifying as 100% high efficiency before, and it would have actually proceeded but for this financial glitch that the previous promoter ran into? And as you rightly said, this was a state-of-the-art innovative thing which didn't fit into the category of wind because with combined heat and power. I do understand that prior to the last. Yeah, well, my point is, what has the material change been to the project, and when will they expect to receive a decision? And what
Great, thank you.
I think we need to be fair to the process here. There's a process under consideration at the moment, so I don't really want to have a sort of a public explanation of all the details of the project. It's under active consideration. We're put a priority on it in the organisation. I'm afraid I'm probably not able to say much more than that.
You have to move on. You've gone way over time, and you cannot discuss the process here. Deputy Chambers, you have 3 minutes.
Thanks, Chair. I'd like to thank the four of you for coming before us. Just three very specific questions. Obviously, with Brexit ongoing, what have your discussions been with the Northern Ireland utility regulator and with the UK around energy security and the impact it'll have, whether we have a soft or a hard Brexit? And can you just give us a brief on that? I think it's important in seeing what's coming and what's going on in the UK. So just something on that. Also, at an EU level, what's the EU interface of moving towards better energy security across the EU in the whole climate change context, and what are your discussions there? And also around price fluctuation and obviously dependence we have on carbon at present, what are the hedging strategies or mandate that you interact with the various energy providers? Like, do you have a macro hedging strategy for Ireland because we're carbon dependent? And obviously there's price fluctuations that occurs there, and we have consumers who complain despite the number of companies that provide energy. There is frustration about the ongoing fluctuation that seems to be quite linked to the active market position, and are we trying? I know a lot of developing countries are trying to efficiently hedge some energy. What are we doing that as we transition to a more efficient energy scenario? So thanks for your time.
So in any order you wish.
Yeah. So just I can say that on the hedging strategies, we do not get involved in the hedging strategies, macro or micro. That's a matter for basically the players in the market to determine, but they have a variety of tools available to them, whether it's proxy hedges. So for example, because the cost of electricity is so closely linked to the price of gas, they can back off some of their price risk in the electricity market with the gas market, or there are hedging tools available within the electricity market, such as two-way and one-way CFDs. In fact, the capacity remuneration mechanism operates on a one-way CFD basis to protect those who are
just on that, would you be able to, through your regulatory position, have some contractual mandate on particular hedging strategies? You wouldn't be allowed to?
No, we don't impose that.
No, and I suppose that's probably one of the ways that
Just for the
suppliers
consumer
compete.
perspective, yeah.
You know, their ability to have an effective hedging strategy, and whether that's owning their own generation capacity, for example, or engaging in different types of hedging, that's the way they compete. That's their competitive advantage. If we come in and start telling them you have to do it in a particular way, first of all, we're saying we have a better idea than anyone else about what's happening in the market, and we don't. And secondly, we're eliminating one of the key competitive areas. What I do think is interesting is there is a huge focus on hedging because everybody's thinking about protecting against the future price. What we may move to is a market where there's more dynamic tariffs available. So, for instance, large energy users might themselves expose part or all of them, their energy consumption to the market price, because then they get the benefit of the lower wind-related price periods. It may be actually that hedging becomes less important, and maybe we move more customers, including domestic customers, into that kind of tariffing arrangement with some protections, obviously, because hedging is notoriously challenging, and we just wouldn't get into that space, in fairness. Thanks.
Gareth, to respond on the EU interface and better energy security.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously this is a key area in the clean energy package as well, the energy security. So we have a function on energy security, and we would make sort of relatively frequent reports, sort of on an annual or biannual basis, to the Commission in terms of our progress. I think energy security, and it's a very good question, has got a lot more complex in many ways. So there's new issues like cybersecurity, and it's one of the areas we've been looking at, and we've been written to the companies and sought them to take extra protection around cybersecurity. So it's an area we can never be in any way sort of relaxed about. I think we have a constant vigilance on energy security. We're only as good as the next incident, so we need to
Are you satisfied with the, as at present there's concerns, the Controller General had concerns with the cybersecurity unit in the Department of Communications. Have you had any interaction with them in terms of, obviously, if there's a cyber attack on our energy system based on the technology we use, have you flagged concerns within government regarding that?
So we have talked to that unit. We've also talked, obviously, to the departmental officials as well that are looking at the NIS directive and the associated directives. But we also talk directly to the companies in relation to cybersecurity. We also share best information with other regulators across Europe. So there's a lot of experience there collectively. And I have had some engagement with the Americans as well about their cybersecurity. So, but cybersecurity, you're only as good as the next incident. We can never be, we have to be constantly vigilant in this area.
Thank you.
Just on the
Brexit one more question, was there? Yeah, the Brexit, yeah.
So,
the microphone will come on itself. Yeah.
On Brexit, obviously we're in a particularly unique situation, I suppose, in relation to anybody else from a Brexit perspective, in that the wholesale market that we operate actually operates on an all-island basis. So it's jointly regulated by both UR and CRU. I think it's fair to say that the focus for the SEM committee who oversee that, and that's a committee comprising the UR, CRU and the independent member, is to protect the single electricity market and ensure that it continues in its current form, whatever the outcome of Brexit. And we've sensed a level of political commitment from both London and from Brussels in relation to that, and that is what we are focused on. We don't get involved in any negotiations in respect of Brexit. Those negotiations are carried out by the government.
Senator Devine, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you. I suppose quick questions to do with costs, and costs are very important for public perception and the public purse as well. Costs and the pricing move into different forms of energy to protect against, I suppose, the rises in electricity prices. We have the 4th highest electricity prices in the EU, and you judge, it seems, the competition in the market on switching rates alone. I don't think it's a complete indicator of competition in the market, and some people can't be bothered to switch. Other people know if they switch, they go back to the original contract after perhaps a year. So what investigations are you doing in the market? You're seeking further powers, but with more powers, I guess, responsibility. And are you using the powers you already have to investigate individual suppliers? But certainly investigations in the market in the pricing, because pricing is obviously key to people buying into the new technology. The question about connection and the delays, there's a lot of complaints from different industries about the delays, but that has been alluded to anyhow. One more question, I'll keep it. You're talking a lot about smart meters for energy, but you're also a regulator for water. Now, smart meters or meters and water in the same sentence ain't going to cut it with the public, as we saw with the outrage on the marches on the street, and it collapsed the idea of metering everywhere. But I suppose I want to ask, smart meters for water, we need data, we need to know how we're using water, we need to know the quality of it, we need community kind of ideas of where the water is going. But it's such an anathema to people in this country. Would it help, in your opinion, if legislation that has been voted down, unfortunately, but legislation to put it in the Constitution that water is public and remains public? Because we will at some stage need to quantify all the data and the usage of water. There's not a lot in your submission on water. It's mostly on energy, and I understand that, but water is quite crucial to, I suppose, sustainability as well. Thank you.
Okay. I'll take the water and you take the...
Okay, so starting with what's happening in the market effectively, so we conducted a major review of competition in retail electricity and gas markets in 2017, just to look at what was going on, what was working well, what wasn't working so well, and what could we do better. And I think one of the key conclusions that we came to from that was that, yes, we see a lot of changes in wholesale prices, and then customers see the changes in the retail price. And what we found was, in general, that the changes in the retail prices were broadly following the underlying market trends. So when prices went down in the wholesale market, with a small lag because of hedging, the retail price came down. And now we're seeing, as prices went back up in wholesale prices, the retail prices are following. So what we did find, though, was that there are benefits to competition out there, and the customers that switch and are active get the best of those benefits. So we decided to look at what can we do using our existing powers to empower customers and to get more people active. We've done a fair bit of research into, well, why don't people switch sometimes? And you're right, maybe some people don't care and it's not a big issue in their household. But there are customers who actually do want to get better value, and sometimes they're put off, they find it confusing, and if they're confused or they're worried they might make the wrong decision, they just step back and don't make any decision at all. So we introduced 3 new measures to help support customers. So one is called the estimated annual bill. So we know from some of the behavioural research we've done that, if a customer's comparing 2 offers and one says 25% off and the other says save €300, that's impossible to compare. But what we asked or required all suppliers to do is say, our offer, the estimated annual bill you would face based on that offer is, let's say, in one case €1,000 and in another case €950. So any customer looking at that can say, well, I want the 950, thank you. So that is now a requirement on all advertising from suppliers on offers to help customers. We also were aware, exactly as you say, that customers do switch, but then they sort of lapse on to a higher standard tariff. And often it's because they've forgotten and they don't realise, and it might be a couple of months before they get another bill and think this has gone up. Why? So we now require all suppliers to send out a notification 30 days in advance of the expiry of the offer period, and remind customers it's time to look around or renegotiate. So you're right, it's not just about switching. We put a lot of emphasis on customers just renegotiating with their current supplier. If you're coming to the end of your tariff period and you pick up the phone to your supplier and say, what can you offer me, or I'm switching, in many cases the supplier will make another offer to keep that customer with them. And the third measure was for customers maybe who've never switched, or it's a long time since they have, that they would get a notice from their supplier saying, it's 3 years since you switched, you've been on the same offer, there are better offers out there, and would you like to talk to us? So that was all rolled out earlier this year in different phases. And now it may be early days, but and also it may be because prices are going up, but we had the highest switching levels in October of this year than we've had in any 1 month period over the last 7 years. So we think there's a message getting out there. Also CRU, for the first time we've had a consumer outreach campaign called Switch On, mostly on social media, because we feel, look, we're you know, they mightn't trust, let's say, SSE or Electric Ireland, you know, giving them objective information, but hopefully they would trust us, and so we give information on our website. So those are the kind of activities. The other things we do, if there's complaints against supplier, we follow up on them. We audit suppliers to make sure they're complying with the supplier handbook, which is the key regulatory protection for customers. So we are quite active in that space, but I probably talked enough.
Okay.
Yeah, and just to address the metering point, I suppose the first thing to note is that the water meters were, it was based around the introduction of a charge. In fairness, I think smart meters have been rolled out in the context of all households already have an electricity meter, and there is a long history of charging for, obviously, for those commodities. So I'd like to separate those two. However, you make a point. First of all, the CRU doesn't have a view on the constitutional amendment per se. What we do have a view on, however, is good data. Good data is absolutely key. We, for example, can't incentivise leakage unless we know what the level of leakage is. We can't hold Irish Water to account for its ability to deliver conservation or whatever it happens to be unless we have good data. So we do rely on the 200,000 odd industrial and commercial meters that are out there, in excess of 600,000 domestic meters. There will be meters in new housing, but as well as that, Irish Water have in place an existing network of district metering, and that network is being invested in to make sure it is now fully functional and upgraded. And it is through the provision of data from those multitude of sources that we would expect to have the ability to deliver the sort of conservation targets that are required in water and the sort of leakage reductions. But until we have really good data, and we're not there yet, and Irish Water have a long way to go in terms of delivering that the level of data that we require. But it's absolutely vital if we're going to deliver on the sort of leakage targets and leakage reductions that we need to deliver.
I'm going to bring in Deputy Pringle.
Thanks, Chairman. Yeah, just a couple of questions. Just in relation to the small domestic generators in the houses and that there, it seems that you have to approve those as well. Is that true? No, you don't. We
don't have any role in licensing domestic scale generation.
Okay.
Below, I can't remember what the threshold is, but we're talking at the domestic level. They don't need any licensing or authorisation.
So they can sell back onto the grid through the ESB without any role input from you?
Well, as we spoke about previously, the real enabler for the prosumer, for people who generate electricity, whether it's from micro wind or micro solar, is through the smart metering programme, which will facilitate the ability to identify when they might want to sell, but also that the level of export can be measured and that the settlement can be agreed between the consumer and the buyer, which could be the retailer or however that works out. But we would see the two as being very linked, basically. The delivery of smart metering will deliver the ability of microgeneration to sell onto the grid.
Well, people who have smart metering now, can they be targeted for the smart meter? The people who have the microgeneration now and the rollout?
So for the first 250,000 of the smart metering installations, people get, so the oldest meters will be replaced as part of the normal replacement, but people can put their hand up and say and ask for one of those. The usefulness of that when it comes to selling any microgen in the home will depend upon things like the information that the smart service is turning on, and whatever other arrangements are out there, such as someone to buy it off them. But so yes, you can if you're one of those active people and you want to avail of this opportunity, you can request a smart meter in the first phase and take it from there. But they will have to wait for the smart services to be turned on before it becomes useful for them. But yes, they can ask for a smart meter.
Okay, and then just one other question, just in relation to the offshore wind. I know probably you don't have what you're talking about as the options, but I mean the barrier to offshore wind is government, what do you call it? I can't remember the name of it now, sorry, but it's a licensing through the Department of Environment is the barrier to offshore wind, not the cost at all. And I'm just wondering what role you have in terms of offshore wind. Like say if offshore wind is developing, do you control the connection points, or do you give access to permission to the connection points? So there wouldn't be 10 connection points along the whole section of coast, there would be 1 or 2 or something like that. Do you control that, or is that maybe that's not even part of your? So
we have no role in relation to the foreshore licensing of these projects, but connection policy, yes, that definitely comes under our area. And what we have to do is determine where does the transmission system, which we presume they will connect in, because they tend to be large-scale projects, where does the transmission system end, and where does the connection, the direct connection to the offshore wind farm begin? And that'll be part of the work that we'll be doing in the context of, for example, if the new Renewable Energy Support Scheme supports offshore wind, then that would be one of the key questions that we will be answering.
Would you see it as each wind farm makes their own connection, or would you see like somebody would have a controlled connection that they would all gravitate towards?
Again, it would all depend on where the siting of these offshore wind farms. If they are in very disparate locations where they're all just going to essentially have a direct connection, then that would drive one particular approach potentially. Whereas if they were all clustered in one area, then there may well be sense in an alternative approach whereby the clusters all link into one hub. But I suppose the key thing from our perspective is that whatever we do, there must be absolute clarity on where the developers' obligations end and where the transmission system operators' obligations begin, because without that we may end up paying twice for something, and we don't want to do that. We want to be absolutely clear, because the cost of connection of offshore wind will by definition be expensive given its location.
Just a follow-up question on Deputy Pringle's line of questioning. So when will the smart services come online with regard to microgeneration? Have you got a date?
Yeah. So the first round of smart services comes online in early 2021, and we're working to try and ensure that the ability for microgen to be accommodated within that would come on stream at that time. So we'll be trying to prioritise that within the package.
Okay. And you spoke, Aoife, about the PSO that supports the peat electricity generation. Could you tell me exactly when that will stop, and also if that could be used to support the transition, so a just transition for the workers? And then what kind of administration or legislation would be required to enable that to happen?
So the peat PSO, I think the contracts for the two plants were 15 years in duration. So as I understand it, if there's no successor co-firing with biomass contract, the contract for the first plant would end at this time next year effectively, and the second one would be early 2020. Now, the way the PSO works, we may still see just the final settlement, if you like, in the following year, but it'll effectively be out of the PSO levy at that point. We will no longer be supporting it through the PSO. And the PSO, it's a public service obligation. It's allowed under Irish and EU law for supporting electricity generation that wouldn't normally be delivered by the market, which is beneficial either from a renewable low carbon perspective or from a security of supply perspective. And the individual rules have to be agreed through a state aid clearance process. So there's actually a complex set of very, very specific state aid documents that say this is exactly what you can use the money for, no more, no less, and then legislation which binds guidelines us as CRU into this is exactly what you can pay them, or calculate the payments. So I think it would be difficult to stop, to continue collecting the money and use it for a different purpose. But there may be other ways of if you were looking at trying to fund the transition, that may be a broader question of things that people have mentioned, like carbon tax or carbon price floors.
Yeah. And then last question. So you said more or less, Paul, as you started, your vision would be security of supply, affordability, and low carbon future. Do you have the resources to actually make this happen? Because this is a huge transition, and we need systemic change. Yeah. So
I think that's a very fair question. I think those who know the CRU will know that our responsibilities have increased over the years, and in fairness, when we've looked for additional resource, we've generally had a good reception from the various departments. However, I think at this point we're carrying out a workforce planning exercise early in the new year. I'll be honest, my expectation is that we're going to identify that we have a resource gap in terms of the delivery of our vision and what we have at the moment, but we'll make that case and we'll put that forward to the relevant departments, and I'm hopeful that we'll have a successful outcome. But yeah, I think we will be challenged from a resource perspective as we go into 2019.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Senator Eamon Ryan.
Thanks for your presentation. It was very interesting, and I think probably all the questions have been asked. Just one question I'd like clarity on. With the advent of smart meters and smart grids, will we have the ability as of now for business-to-business transactions and trading, where you have business in the business where there's production of energy and a business where there's energy consumption, that they can work together to maximise efficiencies and to use best practice to be as efficient as we can?
I think that will be the type of option that will be coming down the track. You may be familiar with the ESB Network's Dingle project, and they're looking at different types of smart technology that would enable what you're talking about there on a community basis. It may use things like blockchain, it may use things, new technologies that we'll all have to get to grips with in terms of, how they work best from a consumer perspective. But that's the kind of innovation that we would be trying to incentivise, see what works best, and I think particularly the value of community schemes. It's not just about building wind farms, but some of exactly what you're talking about there will really help to, I think, bring people with us. So we're very open to that.
Thank you very much. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Dr McGowan and all your colleagues from CRU for coming before us this afternoon. It's very important for our work. So we'll suspend our meeting until 2:30 when we'll have our next round of witnesses. Thank you. So I would like to extend on behalf of the committee a very warm welcome to Lord Eamon, Chairman of the UK Committee on Climate Change, and Chris Stark, who is the CEO. So Lord Eamon and Mr Stark have travelled here especially to come before our committee here this afternoon, and we very much appreciate and are looking forward to our engagement with you here this afternoon. So just to remind all our members and witnesses to turn off your mobile phones or to switch them onto flight mode. I'll now call on Lord Eamon to make your opening statement.
Oh, does it? Well, that's very good. Well, thank you so much for inviting us, and we're very pleased to come. I thought just to start off with, I might say to you what my experience. I've now been chairman for the last 6 years. I've got another 4 years to go, and during that time, certain things have become very clear to me as to be the key issues which have affected our ability to operate. And the first of those is that the Climate Change Act, under which we operate, has sought, I think successfully, to deal with the dysfunction of time, because democracy demands that you have a regular period in which you give a mandate again. You have to have that mandate refreshed. That's what democracy is on the one hand. But on the other hand, climate change demands that you have a continuous policy over a long period of time, because otherwise you can't deliver what we have to deliver. So what the Act did was to ensure that these two could operate together. So what happens is every 5 years we produce the carbon budget and present it to Parliament. We've now done 5 of them, and Parliament has accepted each one of those. And once Parliament has voted on it, therefore the democratic mandate has taken place, Parliament can't change it unless the Climate Change Committee agrees. Now that's a crucial part of this, because of course the difficulty is that if you make decisions immediately, everybody thinks not about the long term at all, but they think about how is it going to affect my constituency, what happens to Mrs. Miggins, what happens to this particular small factory. But if you're trying to get people to think forward, and our budgets are now, the next one we do, which is the 6th carbon budget, will be 2032 to 2036, it's far enough ahead for most members of Parliament to think, frankly, independently and in a holistic way. So you move the discussion to reality and the issues away from the individual questions which you get if you're talking about what do I do tomorrow. And that means that what you're going to do tomorrow is put into the hands of the government and Parliament. And so the second thing is that the Climate Change Committee's job is not to lay down an annual statement of what the government has to do. What it has to do is to keep the government's feet to the fire to keep the targets. Now, the government can do it any way you like. I mean, I've sometimes said if the Secretary of State for Bay's business and climate change, if he wants to do it by standing on his head, and if that works, that's perfectly all right. I've got no... we will give a series of explanations of what needs to be done, a choice, a menu. We've got to prove that what we propose in terms of the targets is possible. So, of course, we have a series of scenarios. If you don't do this, then you'd have to do this, giving the government a range of things. But in the end, we are not there in order to make decisions of a kind that should be made in Parliament. We are there to set the parameters within which those decisions have to be made. Which brings us to number 3. Number 3 is that it's a very carefully arranged system. It means that before the end of June every year, we have to assess how well the government has done in meeting the targets. And that's an independent assessment. And then, before the end of October, the government has to do a response. So if our assessment is pretty tough, as it was this year, government then has to come back to explain what it's going to do, and it has to do that publicly. And again, the advantage of the law is that you have to do it. That's quite difficult for us sometimes, because whatever else we've got on, we've got to produce ours by the end of June, and whatever else the government's got on, it's got to produce by the end of October. So the rule is very tough and clear. And the fourth element in it is the fact that, unlike, I think, anywhere else, the Climate Change Committee is a scientific and economic committee. It is not a representative committee. That, again, is to distinguish it from the representative bit, which is the elected Parliament. So our committee consists of scientists who are themselves seen by their colleagues as being the leaders, and the same of economists. I'm the only non-scientist, non-economist, and I have to be appointed not by the Prime Minister. I'm appointed by the Minister responsible for climate change, the First Minister of Scotland, the First Minister of Wales, and the First Minister of the North of Ireland, when they've got one. And the mechanism, therefore, means that you normally have 4 different parties who are making the decision. In my case, I had a Liberal Democrat member of the coalition government. I had the Scots nationalist in Scotland, I had a Welsh socialist, and I had a Protestant unionist in the north of Ireland. So they've got a Catholic and a Conservative as their chairman. But of course it gives you enormous independence because you genuinely have been chosen by a range of people who have said, you are an independent and we accept that independence. So again, you are able to be critical of whatever government there is. And you can also do something else which is very important, is that you can be congratulatory. When the government gets it right, it's very important for people to say thank you. And being independent, you can say thank you without it looking as if you're being oleaginous or sucking up to them. And that is important, because otherwise people get no encouragement. And the last thing I want to say about the system is that there's one thing that I would have written differently after experience. Not because it hasn't worked, but because I can see that it might not work. And that is that we don't have an independent judgment of how much money we need to run the secretariat we have to meet the requirements of the Act and the things the government asks to do, and the things that we think we have to do in order to meet the Act. Now, I have to say that we have never had an occasion to complain about governments, and we've had three sorts of governments to work under, and we've never had to complain. I mean, they try to keep us within rules and try to restrict what we're spending, of course, because all governments do. But one does have to say, I really haven't got a complaint about it, but I do think that the one thing we didn't get right was that there should have been a court of appeal, so to speak. We should have been able to have appealed to the Controller and Auditor General to assess that we were being given the money. The Act says we have to be given the money to make it possible for us to do the job. There ought to be a bit in the law which made that some sort of independence, which the Controller and Auditor General himself has anyway, so that would be what I would do. So those are the crucial things that we think are important, and it seems to me helpful just to repeat them, because it's after 6 years of being the chairman, I'm very conscious of how valuable those particular elements are.
Thank you very much. So I might go to our questioners, if that's okay. And we're going to start with Deputy Seán Sherlock.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Lord Deben and Mr Stark, for taking the time to attend here today. We're very grateful for your insights thus far. My question is very simple, and I'll have an interactive session with you, if I may, in the few minutes that I have. I just want to get a sense from yourself about Brexit, and to what extent is Brexit informing your thinking as chair in terms of the challenges that you might face throughout the United Kingdom in the foreseeable future?
Well, of course, Brexit is a terrible mistake. It's quite wrong, and I've done everything I can to stop it, and we'll go on doing that. So I want to make quite clear where I stand on this matter. It is balmy, and it's run by balmy people. So it's not easy to operate when you're trying to deal with that. But it happens to be true that our legislation is, in fact, British, United Kingdom legislation. So the climate change legislation is there, and we will continue along those lines. What Brexit makes very difficult is that so many of the protections for the environment as a whole are thrown into doubt. Now, there's all sorts of promises from the government as what they would do and the rest of it, but they aren't there now. And I do think that the insight of the Pope in Laudato Si is extremely important when he talks about climate change as a symptom of what we've done to the world. And I always look at it in those terms. So the rest of the environment is very important for fighting the battle about climate change. You mustn't think of it as a sort of box on its own. And so we are concerned about the other areas of the environmental protection which are guaranteed under European law, and which the government has said will all be taken into account and will be brought into it, but we haven't actually had that legislation, and such legislation as we have doesn't have money in it. And I am basically a practical man, and I like to know where the money's coming from, and I don't see much of that at the moment.
Okay, thank you. And that dovetails nicely with my next question, which relates to carbon budgeting. That is something that is a feature of the landscape in the United Kingdom. We don't have that system here. We are, talking about that system at the moment. It's developing as a concept, if you will. There is some signals coming out of government that it might be a way for government to proceed. Could I get a sense or an understanding of the dynamic that exists between, we'll say, the Prime Minister's office in relation to, as I understand it, setting targets, and how individual line departments actually measure up to those individual targets, and then if you do not reach your target or if you do not hit milestones, is there a punitive effect thereafter, for individual departments? It would be very useful for us here in this committee to have a sense of an understanding of the dynamics that exist between the Prime Minister's office and the actual principle of carbon budgeting in the first instance.
Well, one of the things I find in common as I go around the world and answering questions from New Zealand to Australia and through the rest of Europe is that, of course, there is no government that's really joined up. That's the nature of our system, all our systems, whatever they are. And so you always have people complaining about two things. One is the Treasury and the other is joined up government. The Treasury is bound to find the things we want to do difficult because it likes to have control. And of course, what we're asking is long-term loss of control, which is what always happens. And governments, of course, aren't joined up, and it is our biggest problem. The Prime Minister's office has been extremely supportive for us, but it's not there that the power sits. It sits for us now in the Department of Bays, which is actually a great success. They were very worried when the Department of Energy and Climate Change was amalgamated with the Business Department. But actually it works, and it works because we are moving from the position in which decarbonising our electricity system was the key thing, and that's what's enabled us to decouple growth from emissions. And now other things become more important, whether it's transport or houses and particularly land use. All those become more important. And we're going to have to be much more iterative with other departments now. And it would be foolish to say that that there is enough joined up, although I'm pleased to see that the Department of Transport, having been recalcitrant and having incurred my ire, has now come into line and has accepted the budget properly. And so, I mean, in the end, you win these battles. But I don't think it's just about climate change. I think it's about so many other things, and it's very difficult to get policies across the board. You think about nutrition, think about obesity, where Ireland's got a similar problem to the problem that we've got in the United Kingdom. It should be education, it should be health, it should be the Prime Minister's office. It's really very important to get it across government, but you haven't managed it and we haven't managed it. I think this is a battle you always have.
Yeah. Because again, that leads me to the one of the recommendations of our own Citizens' Assembly, where they spoke about creating an independent body above government, if you will, with legislative teeth that could actually put manners, if you will, on individual departments, and it would take it out of the silo-based system that we all understand so well. And I'm just wondering if there is merit in that argument.
Look, I was a Member of Parliament for nearly 40 years, so I'm very conscious of the democratic concept. I think it's very dangerous to take it like that. Okay. I think what you need to do is to distinguish between the two elements. The element of parliamentary decision-making about what you should do, and the element of setting the targets against which you will be judged. Now, in the end, if the government does not meet its targets, they are a statutory target and they could be taken to court and they could be forced to meet them. Now, I wouldn't take them to court, but whoever did take them to court, I'd be first witness for the prosecution. And so I'm hoping that government will do its job, because otherwise I would be rather embarrassed. But that's what one would have to do. So the system works in that way. So it's very difficult for people to say there isn't proper democratic control. It's really up to the specialist committee. It's up to the... If you give enough power to the equivalent of the Climate Change Committee, then you do enable us, in effect, to pressurise this. So I've used the example of transport, just so that he knows it's happening. I'm about to start the same campaign with the Secretary of State for Local Government, because he's the housing minister, and we are at the moment building crap houses. In other words, we're building houses which we're going to have to re-kit very rapidly. And you're doing it in Ireland too. One of the things you could make a huge difference, and I'm trying to get the devolved parliaments to do the same, which is to say, we are not having these houses built. You have to meet a standard, because it's so dishonest. You're selling a house at a price, and people are then having to pay significant sums to keep them warm, when that isn't counted in the price, so to speak. So what you have to do is to build houses where people don't spend that sort of money. At the same time, you are reducing the impact on the environment and on pollution, and therefore on climate change.
Thank you.
I'm going to move on to our next Deputy Tom Neville.
Thank you, Ceán Sherlock, and thank you very much for coming in to both of you. Just a couple of quick questions around agriculture. The approach in the UK, what approach in the UK was taken in respect to agriculture and climate change, as in where were the quick wins in relation to agriculture, and where were the challenges or the current challenges in that? I'll start with those questions first, if you don't mind, Chair, and we'll interact after that.
Well, I'm a former Minister of Agriculture, and I come from an agricultural background, and I keep cows, so I think I'm reasonably in line with this. I never think that the word quick wins, or the phrase quick wins, works with agriculture. This is a long-term operation. And we have just produced the first of 2 reports on land use. And I'm rather keen on using the word land use rather than agriculture, because we've got to think about the whole of that. In the United Kingdom, we have a slightly different issue, because we have had intensification of agriculture to a degree which is greater than in Ireland. And therefore, one of the things that we have to do is to have a lot more mixed farming, because we have damaged the fertility of our soil, and therefore we've got the double issue of emissions, and also the fact that the fertility of your soil has been damaged enough to mean that it is not capable of sequestrating the amount of carbon that it should be. So we are moving towards de-intensification of livestock. I mean, this has had a mixed reaction from the National Farmers Union, as you can imagine, but surprisingly supportive, as long as we do it properly. Our problem is that because of the balmy policy of leaving the European Union, we're going to hit farmers with the first time in which they haven't had production support since 1939. There's no living farmer in the United Kingdom who has ever worked in a situation without production support. And the government's told them they're not going to have any. They think, happily, there'll be £3 billion fed into farming in a different way. Well, they haven't met the Treasury. The fact is, it won't be like that. If it's £500 million, they'll be lucky, and this £2.5 billion will come out. This is going to give them a huge problem anyway. And when you asked Mr. Sherlock before about Brexit, I think one of the problems is going to be that we're going to have to ask farmers for real changes at the same time as these things are going to hit them. Now, you won't be in that position. It seems to me that what Ireland needs to do is to recognise that there aren't any quick wins, but there are ways of improving the situation by using modern technology, by getting the farmers on the side and by measuring better. One of the things we're very bad at is that we don't measure agricultural output and output of pollution as well. So farmers say, we've done all this. You have really no idea whether they really have. So you've actually got to get a measurement right. And in the UK, we refuse to do the work until the Agriculture Ministry, DEFRA, had actually given us some basic measurements, so you can then do that. So there aren't quick wins. It's a slow, regular, continuous policy working with the farmers to reduce their emissions. But you have to do it because farming in Ireland, but in the United Kingdom and everywhere else, is a major emitter. And one of the things I would hope that Ireland could do would be to join with others like, for example, New Zealand, who've got the same intensity of problem, because you have a big agricultural sector, to try to share knowledge about the things that you can do. Ireland could be a real leader on this, and you could also shame the rest of the islands to do better things. So I really think there's a role for Ireland in the agriculture work, because we've got to do it. We have to face the fact that we can't allow agriculture to emit what it does now. So we've got to find ways of enabling farmers to continue, but to do so in a more environmentally friendly way.
And what would your opinion then be in relation to agricultural emissions, where Ireland has been recognised as actually one of the lower carbon emitting agricultural sectors relative to other countries in the globe, and that the argument that would be, if there was a reduction obviously in productivity here, that would be met up, or that slack would be taken up by a country which would be less carbon efficient. Has that been discussed as part of your committee?
Yes, I mean, one of the reasons why it's more difficult is the point that I made to begin with, is that because we have moved to more monoculture than Ireland has, we can make changes in that area which because you are already a lower intensity carbon based agriculture, can't do. If I may say so, the one argument that none of us should have is we can't do it because if we do it then someone else will take up the slack. The fact is we've all got to do it, and that's what Paris means, and we can't stop trying to do it ourselves because somebody else will do it. We're all going to do it, and actually the people we say will take up the slack are also trying to do it. The French are trying to do it, the Germans are trying to do it, we're trying to do it. And the one thing I won't take from our farmers is to say, well, if we do this, then the Irish will take up the slack. The fact is, that's what all industries say. It's what we had with all the industries and the change for decarbonising energy always was, we can't do it because the French or the Chinese or whoever you happen to want to put in that box will only take up the slack. The truth is they haven't, because they're all trying to do it. And I think it's much better to take the opposite view, which is to say we will go and work with the people who might take up the slack to find how we do it, all of us, because we've all got to do it. And I know from my going to, I did a very large, in terms of numbers of meetings, tour of New Zealand 18 months ago, and I know that the New Zealanders, who face the same problem in lots of ways, want to work with other agricultural areas, and they want to work to find answers.
Final question, sorry, Chair. And based on what you've said then, have you discussed and how you balance that with an increased demand on food productivity?
Well, the fact is we're going to have to eat less meat. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I'm a passionate believer that vegetarianism isn't the answer, so you don't get me doing that. But what you do have to do is that we eat too much meat. We know no previous generation's eaten as much meat as we do. We're going to have to produce, and the production of meat has a real effect upon the climate, and we're just going to have to eat less and better meat. Now, that ought to be good for Ireland, because Ireland produces good meat. There's a lot of good grass-fed meat which comes from Ireland, and what we've got to do is to recognise that quite a lot of meat that is produced in a way which produces a lot of emissions, and it isn't very good meat. And we've got to move away from the copying of the American meat concept to one in which we do eat less meat. But I must say I'm quite strong about saying that doesn't mean to say we become vegetarian. And I'm not even proposing that we should eat meat at the level which departments of health say would be good for us. I'm not going as far as that. What we are proposing is a relatively limited reduction in the amount of meat we eat. Still won't meet the dietitians' figures. Slightly questioning about their figures, but there we are. We're not going to reach that. But we know we've got to move down that route, and people will be very much better if they just have good meat, and some of the rubbish which goes onto the market now is removed, which is the very part you want to get rid of.
Okay, so you're talking about focusing on meat that's lower carbon produced, for want of a better word.
Well, you focus, I mean, if you have less meat, then you produce less emissions, in general. If you have the sort of meat which is produced in much of Ireland, you're also replenishing the soil in a way which is very important for the sequestration of soil, and you provide meat which has the ingredients which people ought to have, rather than the sort of meat that comes from feedlots and the like. Now, it'll mean that people will eat less because it'll be more expensive, because it is more expensive to produce it that way, but that will do us no harm. And you have to be honest about it.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Deputy Eamon Ryan.
Thank you very much, Lord Denham. I'm going to have to run out shortly. I have to go up to speak on Brexit in our own review of the European Council last week. I'll be saying to them, we will not let the brothers next door get us down. We will maintain our close connection, and particularly in energy and climate, we will not be able to decarbonise if we're not connected, in my mind. We have to balance this variable supply of electricity. That makes sense to do it on a northwest European grid basis, and we have everything to do. We have fantastic connections. Lord Putnam, who was involved in the drafting of your legislation, is a good friend of this House. He's been a huge assistance to the Irish governments over the years. Similarly, we brought over Alex Chisholm, dusted him down, trained him up and sent him back now as your permanent secretary. Our energy regulator, Dermot Nolan, heads Ofgem. Our former head of National Grid set up the Gas and Electricity Grid Network Company. We have huge connections, and I'm sure we'll be able to overcome the politics to maintain cooperation. Can I ask, if you look at what's happened in Britain, there's been a real success. 40-something% reduction in emissions since 1990, ongoing reductions last year 2.5%. But if you look at where that's come from, it's largely from power generation, the move away from coal. As you say, in your own area, in transport, land use and other sectors, you're flatlining, much like everywhere else. I agree with you fundamentally that vision of Francis, that it's a big picture change we're doing, and it's system change we need. How are you going to bring that in? That's right, it's a very broad question, but how close are you to that sort of system change in transport and in agriculture particularly, which seems to be the key to unlocking the next step in the decarbonisation?
Well, first of all, you are right that the decarbonisation of electricity has in some senses overshadowed the flatlining in other areas. Transport will be significantly changed by that decarbonisation of electricity, because electric vehicles become actually more sensible, because you are using non-carbon fuel in the sense. And we are pressing the government to move much faster on that front. The government has a policy which will not meet the requirements. We're not going fast enough, and that will have to happen. And I have no doubt they'll make it happen, because they certainly aren't going to move to any proposal for net zero, which we are now working on, if you don't do that. So that is one of the areas you've got to speed up. We've got to speed up very significantly. I agree with you that we shall have to work together, because energy, of all things, is a Northern European issue. It's not just a matter between Ireland and the United Kingdom. It's much wider than that. And I hope Ireland goes on sticking to its guns about what are the responsibilities of the United Kingdom towards Ireland, and trying to walk away as if there are no responsibilities is both historically wrong and I think morally unacceptable. So a bit of continued pressure is going to be rather important, and I certainly think we've got to keep the relationships because it's the only way in which both parts of these islands will be able to operate, because it's ridiculous otherwise. And we, of course, depend in the United Kingdom significantly on the energy that we get from France. Different peak moments are very helpful. It's not just a question of bringing the energy over, but they have a different peak system from ours. We are, as you know, hoping to have a link with Norway, which would provide us again with a very important thing. And there's a great deal to be done, and Ireland could play a big part in it, in getting the continental European links more effectively. I mean, there is an estimate, and I don't know how accurate this is, but that there's 11% of saving to be got by getting the interconnectors between, for example, the Netherlands and Belgium and France and Spain. Because frankly, we ought to be using the sunshine in Spain and the wind in the United Kingdom and Ireland. That's what we ought to be doing, and it's sort of mad that we're not. But the links are not good enough yet. So I agree with you entirely. That's what we should be doing.
To system change, your recent report on land use, reducing emissions and preparing for climate change is very impressive and very relevant, I think, for us, even though we have different agricultural systems. Am I right in reading that where you're going with that is towards a national land use plan within UK, in terms of where forestry is, what type of farming, where? Do you think it's important or useful to have such a land use plan as part of how we manage this?
Well, yes, I think it is. I don't think it's quite as directive as you make it seem like that. But, for example, if we are to do something about flooding, we're going to have to plant trees in the right place, and we're going to have to plant the right sort of trees. And all this is really difficult, because the right trees are not the trees which the public think of when you talk about forest trees, because they're not broadleaf trees. The right trees are actually conifers, because they, being much older in prehistoric times in that sense, have an ability to absorb carbon for a longer period of time, and of course they produce wood which can be readily used in furniture and in building, so that you maintain the sequestrated carbon. So we've got a big story to get right across the board. So that's part of what it is. It's partly too that it's not just adaptation we're trying to do in this case, but also we will need to do a lot more soft defence against flooding, and a great deal more about how we deal with land use as far as the sea is concerned, because the rising sea levels are a really serious part of what we're faced with.
Can I just ask, I was interested to hear your travails with Treasury. It's the same in every country, and from a distance we've been watching your Treasury Department get energy policy completely wrong. But when it comes to parliamentary committees which you engage with, do you do that with is each sectoral committee, or is there any collective parliamentary system within the House of Commons to our Lords to engage in this issue? Is it just each sectoral committee, or do you have any collective parliamentary connection?
Well, there is a DEFRA select committee which deals with the issues of agriculture and land use and in that way. And then there is a select committee for BEIS, which deals with climate change and specifically, and business and energy. But the select committee from BEIS does consider itself overlooking the whole collection, and we use it in that sense. But there are also other select committees for each of the departments, and we try to use those effectively to get the particularities of climate change listened to.
The very last question, if I can, Chair. Your committee is very impressive when you look at the individuals on it, and quite science-heavy in terms of only one or two economists, unless people are disguising their economic credentials. Do you think that's the right balance? We tend to have a climate committee which has a lot of economists on it and less scientists. Have you? I know you have to be careful and diplomatic here, but
I've never been accused of that before.
Have you a shortage of economists on your committee, or are you happy with the number you have?
No, I don't think. I mean, we have some, particularly the chief executive of the Institute of Fiscal Studies. We have some pretty tough and feisty economists. I don't think that's a problem. And the point about the scientists is that they all contribute different things to it. So, for example, when I became chairman, one of the things I insisted upon was having a behavioural scientist. We had never had that. And I do think that one of the problems that we all face is you have to move on from getting what's right in science and economics to helping people to take these things on board. And you need a behavioural scientist, I think, to give you that advice. So, no, I don't think so. I think the sort of balance we have is right. I've nearly got it to 50-50 between men and women, which I'm quite proud of. But you have to go and seek people then. Nobody is appointed on gender basis, but women are sometimes less willing to put their name forward. So you have to go out and work on that. But I think that's an important part of it. It is one of the areas in which you do have a real need for a range, and women bring a different way of looking at things from the men, I find, on the committee.
And just one further point is that the Secretariat that supports the committee has a great many economists on it, so there's an expertise there that the committee can draw on, and actually that combination of economists doing the analysis and scientists doing the inquisition works extremely well. So that combination.
Yeah. Senator Daly.
Thanks, Chair. You're very welcome, Lord Evan. I suppose, simply speaking, when you build your house or your home here or anywhere, you put a lot of thought and effort into it, and you're very happy with the outcome. You live in it for a while, and then you say, if you got a second chance, there are so many different things you would do differently. From your experience and the fact that I suppose we're that phase behind you here, if you were this side of the table with a second chance, second bite of the cherry, what different directions might you like to see the developments going, or what, if you were back on a blank page with your own committee, are there any directions you've gone in that, if you got a second chance, you might revisit or take a different option or angle? And bearing in mind from where we're sitting, like agriculture has been mentioned, we never had the Industrial Revolution. The reason our percentage of agricultural emissions are so high in the overall picture is we didn't have the heavy industries that we could work on that you did. And from a transport perspective, like you go to London, you might never put your head up from underground and you can get around. Here we don't have the same public transport. So from them two perspectives, with agriculture and transport in particular in mind, we're starting from a different position than you started. But if you had a second chance, looking at our model, is there anything you would have, a different approach you may have taken?
Well, I think it's true that if one had started afresh, we would have been better to have pressed the DEFRA department, the Agriculture department, to get its figures right earlier, so we could have started on land use earlier. I think that is one thing that we could have done. We couldn't do the work on it because we didn't have the figures, and I wasn't prepared, nor was my predecessor, to put out things which were not absolutely correct according to the statistics and the science. And indeed, I should have said in my opening points that the other thing that is absolutely crucial is, if you have a climate change committee, it has got to get a reputation for being accurate and scientifically based, and not a campaigning group. It's not an NGO. It really is. It has to be very scientifically based. So I think one of the things I would have done if I had been running it at that time, and I think looking back, I don't know whether I'd have thought of it at the time, but now looking back, I think that was one thing, because I do think that land use is the most difficult, and it's the point that Mr. Neville, you talked about quick and easy, so to speak. I just think there is no quick and easy, and therefore you've got to get it started very much earlier. That's the thing. And the other thing, which I think one might have done differently, would have been to start the pressure on government for the need for electric vehicles earlier, because that's really going to be an important thing. And I think we hit the ground a couple of years later than we might have done on that, enabling government to set targets which are just not sensible. We can't wait to 2040. We've actually got to make the changes in 2030. Otherwise, the figures don't add up. And we've got to do this together, because the market is a part of the same market, so it's very important for Irelanders. And the motorcar companies are behaving disgracefully. If you go out and try to buy an electric car today, you're on a waiting list. Unless you can afford a Tesla, you're on a waiting list. And that is because the motorcar companies are busy trying to sell the cars that they can make cheaply now, and they don't want you to buy the electric cars. At the same time, they're telling a different story to government. I just think we've got to be much tougher, as we've got to be very tough with the building companies. I think the house builders have got to be forced to build to a higher standard. So those are the things that I would have started earlier, I think.
Good. Deputy Smith.
Thanks very much. And thank you very much for your presentation, but mostly for your directness and your honesty, because I don't know if an awful lot of people in this house want to hear things like tell it like it is, don't blame it on somebody else, that if you can't do it yourself, you can't say, well, others would do it. I mean, we had the farming organisations here recently saying if we don't increase the herd and export the cattle, then the Brazilians will do it, or the New Zealanders will do it, and it's just drive you mad that they, you know, the argument that you don't make a start yourself is wheeled out so much. So I really appreciate your honesty on that, and also I think the whole issue of land use, what we eat, how we produce what we eat, needs a huge discussion. And no better country than Ireland to have it, because we have loads of fallow land, and we have loads of farmers who want to be farmers and who could diversify. We really need to have that discussion in an honest way. But I think because you're over from England, and if you don't mind me calling you Mr, I find it really strange calling somebody a Lord.
It's wrong with anything you like.
Mr. Devon, I'd like
calling you a deputy.
Yeah. I know you're from the House of Lords, but I find you say Lord, I can say that to you. Just something that I've noticed in England recently is the pressure from the fracking companies to frack, and the response of the people. And I've been really in awe of the protesters. I mean, they've gone out of their way to try and get their voices heard in a democratic way, and they've been blocked by local authorities left, right and centre. And the sort of protests that we've seen in Lancashire and Blackpool and all the rest of it, they've been some ways quite scary, that people feel they have to do that, but in other ways fracking is also quite scary. And if you're the representative of Climate Change Committee, could you comment on the increase in, or the attempt to increase the use of fracking, and also on the protests? And I would like to use the opportunity to say I would extend my solidarity to both those and the young people who were involved in the Extinction Rebellion, where they blocked the bridges around London and glued themselves to Westminster. And I think that what young people are saying to us, we've seen this in Sweden and Australia, is listen to us, it's our future, and they're tired of old farts like me not listening to them. So I'd like to hear your comment on that, and just a couple of other quick questions on the actual mechanism of your committee. See, we have the first recommendation from our Citizens' Assembly that met. 94% of them recommended that we establish how do they put it? Let me see. Sorry, now I have to refer to a document. they recommended in their first recommendation that we should establish a new and independent body with a broad range of functions and powers to deal with climate change, and to ensure that it's at the centre of policy making with some legislative scrutiny and oversight. The resistance to that from our representatives, at least from the Department of Finance so far, has been quite passionate. They don't believe in this at all, they don't want to see it. Could you say to us as representatives of Parliament why you think that that would be a good idea, since you're part of one yourself, and the 2 or 3 main reasons why you think it would be a good idea for us? And lastly, to ask you about the value of the carbon budget, because I think this is needed here, and that the carbon budget, I understand it's set at a certain level through the use of science, and the use of science is hugely important in this, and that if you go over that, then you're breaking the budget. But what penalties are there for the government or the state for overstepping the mark, or can they offset the budget by selling, by carbon offsets? Do you agree with that? Do you think it should be allowed? Or is that just another market mechanism that fails to actually deal with the emissions? I have 1 or 2 other questions, but I don't know.
Well, there's quite a lot there. First of all, we did a report on fracking, and I think we have to distinguish between fracking and the issue about fracking and the protests in London on the bridges and the rest of it, which I'll come to again. I think that you have to follow the science. If you're going to insist that people accept the science on climate change, then you've got to follow the science on other things. And the science on fracking is very clear. As long as you do 3 things, fracking is perfectly reasonable. The 3 things you have to do is, first of all, you have to make sure that any gas which you produce from fracking is a replacement for gas that you would otherwise import from somewhere else, so that it isn't additional. And secondly, you have to ensure that you have proper environmental controls in place. So, for example, you can cap the very possible rogue well, because sometimes the well bursts up and you have to cap it immediately. You've got to have that in place. And thirdly, you have to ensure that you do not build infrastructure which gives you an excuse then to go on using gas beyond the point at which it is possible to do so within the envelopes which we have placed. Now, that's what we've said, and fracking has to be done within those restrictions. Now, if you say you don't want to frack, let's say they do find a reasonable amount of gas. If they do, they will be producing gas which we will need until the early 2030s. We've said that in our budgets, that we will need it. They will be producing gas with less environmental impact than the gas that you would be importing from countries, many of which you don't particularly believe are taking any of the steps that you should take. Now, I'm afraid I am not an absolutist on this. I think that if we can get some fracked gas at a lower carbon cost than the imported gas for that period, as long as it doesn't give us the excuse for continuing longer, and that's part of the deal, I think that that's the right thing to do, and the science certainly says that. And if you want people to believe in climate change on the basis of science, you've got to use science right across the board. And I do find the protesters actually rather different from you. I have a great deal of sympathy with the protesters on the bridges of London. I'll come to that in a moment. But I do find the fracking protesters wrong, because they are trying to say that their non-scientific position is one which should be forced upon the public because of the scientific position on climate change. It seems to me to be an illogical position to be in. And that's why we did the independent report. That's why the independent report is there, and that is why the government is supporting the independent report. Now, if you come to the campaigners, the biggest problem about climate change is that we, even though we believe in it now, We're not moving fast enough. The urgency is huge and tremendous, and it's very important for those who really care about it to remind people of that. So I have a real sympathy. I'm not sure that all their tactics and such like are right, but I have a real sympathy with people who get out there and say, you've got to move faster. And that helps us enormously, and it helps the good side of government enormously, and it has a good effect on some of the sillier members of government who don't actually take this seriously. So I have a greater degree of sympathy with that, because I think, in a sense, that although, of course, you equated it with what happened in Australia. In Australia, there's every reason. It's a very bad government, which is not doing anything on climate change, which should be ashamed of itself, and any protest there is really different from, at least in Britain, we have an all-party consensus, all parties are doing, and it really doesn't matter to me what sort of government you have, because they're going to do the same programme. I mean, there is no doubt about that. And we're very, very fortunate. In Australia, they're in a much worse position, and the present government of Mr Morrison is worse than the previous one. I don't think there could be. And the previous one was not any better than Mr Abbott. And if you can't be better than Mr Abbott, you really are in a mess. So they have a real reason to be very, very powerfully opposed. Now, about the issue of the independent body, I think that treasuries are always opposed to this, because it means that they are restricted in what they can do. But they have to be, because climate change demands that we do have long-term plans. Treasuries like to be able to move things very rapidly, and in general terms, that's right. But we're not in that situation. We're in an extinction situation. This is a really serious thing. And treasuries don't like it, not because they're not green, not because there's something evil about them. It's just simply that if you're in the Treasury, you don't want that sort of control. We had it in Britain. I won't use the word that she used, but the advisor to the Labour government, when we managed to get a parliamentary majority for the Climate Change Act, which was unthought of, went into the Department then of Climate Change and flung the bill across the table and said, there you are, you've got your act. Because they were furious, not because they were opposed to it, just because it meant the Treasury no longer had that control, and that's exactly where they are now. So we have to say to the Treasury, wherever it is, we have to say to the Treasury here in Ireland, look, I know what you instinctively want, but you can't stay there, because we are fighting a battle which will distinguish human beings as being really human or not. We either win this battle or we lose the battle for our own existence. So we have to win this battle. And part of it is about us being human, and we've got to find new ways of expressing that. And having an independent committee is crucial. I would give it the powers that we have, but I would make a distinction. I know what your Assembly suggested, but I think it's quite important that I don't have the powers to legislate about particular answers, because that brings me into the political arena. I have the powers to fix and to keep them fixed, the budgets. And governments have got to find the way of meeting those budgets. And as I say, it doesn't matter to me how they find the way, but they have to do it. And my power is to make sure they do it. So you asked me, what are the penalties? The penalties are that this is justiciable. They would be taken to the High Court, and the High Court would insist that they produced policies which would meet it, because that is what the law says. We have got to reduce our emissions by 80% by the year 2050, and we have got to meet the targets which are in the budgets, the fourth and fifth carbon budgets, which are the next two budgets. And the law can be brought into play at the point at which it's clear that the government is not taking the measures that it ought to do. Now, the courts are not going to say to the government, you've got to do this and you've got to do that. What it would say to the government is, you have a target to meet and you've got to prove to us that you're actually going to meet it. That's what the law says. And that's the power I think you ought to have. I wouldn't ask me to do the legislation, because if I do that, then I'm choosing between, for example, electric cars and doing so much and houses doing so much. That is a decision for government, democratically reached. What isn't a decision is, how does it add up? I do the sum. They can do the bits of the sum, but they have got to add up to the figure that I and my committee do. And I think that's the power, that's the distinction. If you do it any other way, they will say it's above politics, but it will become politicised. The moment you give it legislative powers, it then has a competition with the Dáil. There's no other way out of it. So don't do that. The Dáil makes those decisions and those choices, but the committee sets the standard against which those decisions have to be made. I think I don't know how we managed to invent this, but it is really a very good invention.
Can I come back on one thing? Sorry, that's very useful. Thanks very much. But I do take issue with you on the science, because we have banned fracking here in Ireland, and we did so on the basis of the understanding that the science has settled on the fact that 80% of known fossil fuels should be left in the ground. Now, that flies in the face of what you're arguing there. It's a bit like what you said earlier on, if we can't do it, somebody else can. But if it's already extracted, if the gas is already extracted, be it in Europe or where else, why would you want to take more out of the ground in Lancashire or Blackpool?
Well, the fact is that under the budgets which we have set, we are going to take more gas out of the ground in Dubai or in Russia over the next years, and that's what it means by 80% left in the ground. It means that 20% isn't going to be left in the ground, so that's going to happen anyway. The question is, if we produce it at home under the tough measures that we have, we won't be buying it from Mr. Putin. If you buy it from Mr. Putin, he hasn't got any of those measures in place. What we are not prepared to do is to mean that if you were going to have 100, I'm just using it just as a figure, 100, you're not allowed to have 120 because you're producing it at home. You've got to keep it at 100. And I do think there's an issue here. The science is very clear. The science isn't that it is, I mean, you can say that the science says that we'd have to keep 80% in the ground, but that means you've got 20%, which you've got to decide where it comes from. The science is very clear, and that is that if you frack properly with these very tough measures, that actually means that you will have gas with less emissions than you would if you took gas from many of the sources that you have today. So if you want to stick to the science, you can't stand up there and say that fracking is unscientific, which is what the campaigners do. It's a choice you make. I would prefer to have what we need for gas from a source which was not controlled by Mr. Putin than from a source which is controlled by Mr. Putin, because I can make sure that its polluting effect is significantly less. What I have to say to anybody who does that is, don't think you're going to have a market after about 2032. So if you can make it work up to then, but don't think there's a market after 2032, because there ain't.
Very good.
Thank you, Chairperson. And like previous speakers, welcome Lord Debon and Mr. Stark here today, and for your quite frank views on the whole matter. Just a couple of brief questions. I suppose from an agricultural point of view, I think you mentioned it briefly yourself in your own background, and we see continuously in Ireland and I suppose across the world, really, to a certain extent, the producer is looking for more for the product, the consumer is looking for that product at the supermarket shelves for a less price. In order to achieve what needs to be achieved going forward from a climate change point of view, there's going to be extra cost involved to do that. How do we square that circle, in your opinion?
Well, some circles can't be squared. I think that's one of the things we all have to accept. And that's why I'm saying that, in general, I think it's true that and these are not just for climate change reasons, we all know from health reasons, we are going to have to eat less meat. That is true. And the way to eat less meat is to cut out that meat which is produced in the least climate-friendly way. And it means actually emphasising the production of meat in the way which Ireland is best at. I mean, at least we are saying that. You are best at extensive meat production. That's what you're good at. That's why people buy Irish beef. They don't buy it because it's been fed on feedlots. They buy it because it's fed in a traditional way. So I am afraid that one of the parts of your questions is about food prices. Now, there is a real issue about food prices, which is that we have now, all of us, lived our entire lives with food prices coming down. None of us can remember a time in which food prices went up. It's only very recently that we begin to see a slight change. And I'm afraid that politicians have promised, in a sense, that it'll always go on going down like that. I'm afraid it won't. Not just because of climate change, but because of the fact that there will be, what is it, 1 billion more middle-class people in the world by the year 2030, all of whom will have the opportunity of buying more than subsistence food. The pressures on food are going to be considerably greater. And you know the damage that has been done to our food industry, and I sit on the Food and Drink Sector Council in the United Kingdom. I'm a passionate supporter of the food industry. I just have to say, look at the damage that has been done to the food industry by the kind of fraud that we've had. And why is that fraud? It is because people were trying to produce at an absolutely unacceptable price stuff that was supposed to be meat. And I'm afraid we are going to have to talk truth. And talking truth is that if we grow food properly, it isn't going to be as cheap as it was. And the proportion of our incomes which we spend on food is not going to go on falling. I'm afraid that is a truth. Whatever political party we belong to, we aren't going to be able to solve that problem. So our job is to try to make the transition to a situation in which food prices are more stable and people don't expect to get 14 meatballs for €2. We have to make that transition as well as we can, which means helping the poorest. It means making sure the farmers are incentivised. It means reform of the common agricultural policy so that the money goes in the right ways instead of some of the wrong ways that it has done. It means all those things. But above all, it means us telling the truth. And I think we haven't been prepared to tell the truth.
Just a follow-up question, if I may, just two follow-up questions. I suppose I personally feel the communication around all this is crucial, and we have to tell people, as you're rightly doing here today, exactly as it is, the consequences. What did you do, or how did you go about doing that across the water when you started this process? How did you start to educate, if I could put it that way, the people exactly what was going to be involved, the consequences maybe, the implications of what needed to be done, straight across the board, be it the agricultural sector, be it the consumer, be it the ordinary Joe public? What kind of a strategy, communication strategy did you put in place? And a different question, you mentioned in your opening statement about the intensification issue from an agricultural point of view. What could you maybe tease out that a little bit more? Obviously, there's, I suppose, to a certain extent, the British farmers would be more factory-type farmers than Ireland. And is that, are you talking about a reduction in the herd?
Well, let me just deal with that second one first. I mean, we are faced in the United Kingdom with health advice which suggests that we should reduce the amount of meat we eat dramatically, much more than you need to do for climate change reasons. The health recommendations suggest very much greater cuts. And so we haven't found ourselves in quite the position which we might otherwise do, because we're talking about cuts of 25% in the food meat. That's sort of between 25 and 50%. That's what we're talking about. The health people are suggesting you should do very much more than that. So that's the beginning of a process, and we're finding considerable support among farmers who want to do that because they want to get a higher price for well-produced meat. And frankly, we all eat so much more than we actually need. We're probably able to spend about the same amount of money with buying the sort of size of meat that we want. You all know that, I mean, the sort of thing that restaurants do, whether they follow the Americans and where quality and quantity are connected, that is utterly in the best and smartest restaurants, the quantity is not very great, but the quality is particularly good. So I think this can be managed. I think that part is. Now, if you take the general communications thing, most people have brought back teeth with most things, in climate change being one of them. I mean, most people, this isn't the big issue. This isn't the thing they want to talk about. They believe in it. They notice the rain comes down in a different way. They notice spring comes earlier. They notice the weather is different. They notice all that. But this is not what they want to talk about all the time. So my view is very simple, which is that you talk about it in other contexts. So I'll give a couple of examples. We've now got a situation in which the Royal Botanical Gardens in Edinburgh, for example, is going to ensure that when you go round and you look at these specimen trees, and vast numbers of people go, it will point out that these trees come out 17 days earlier than they used to come out, and that's one of the problems because the bees don't come out at that same time. So at a point at which somebody's interested, you tell them about it. Similarly, the Forestry Commissioners agreed that they'll do the same thing in forests when you go and look at the trees, that they will remind you that they are planting different trees because of climate change. And similarly, we are pressing all the time that when news bulletins are talking about these things, that they talk about the climate change bit in the context that they are speaking. And if I were being pretty controversial, I think it's important to get the same reaction when bulletins talk about issues and don't mention the climate change bit of it that you get if they are sexist. You know, there's a terrible row, isn't there, if they say something which doesn't recognise the part that women play in society or the rest of it. And quite rightly, women and their supporters spend a lot of time going back at the broadcasters, back at the newspapers, making sure that that's not what you can do. We've got to do the same on climate change. We've got to just make sure that people can't ignore it. And the interesting thing is that at long last, the BBC has started to treat it seriously. We've had awful trouble in the past, but when we had the meeting of the COP in Poland, for the very first time, as chairman of the Climate Change Committee, I was asked to comment on it. And I didn't have some lunatic Lord, what's he called? Lawson, sitting there telling me what's about the science which he doesn't understand. He didn't have that talk. They accepted that this was a proper conversation. So we had a proper conversation about how well it had done, what it had missed. And there is a change, and we have to keep that going all the time. So that my communication strategy is all the time to make sure that the implications of climate change are talked about when you're talking about something else. So bottled water, for example, I hope everyone else does this. If people offer me bottled water in a restaurant, I insist upon having tap water. And I do it, and I do very often politely explain why it seems to me to be balmy to bring in our islands, all of us have got perfectly good water. And therefore, if you want flat water, you should have it out of the tap. I don't know where this comes from, but I'm sure it is out of the tap, and that's what it should be. I know that's a small thing, but that's what you have to do on everything. Just quietly, in the issue, when it comes up, talk about it. because it's no good doing a public campaign, because this is not what people want to spend their leisure hours learning about. It's just putting it into the conversation at the right points.
Mr. Sullivan.
And thank you for being here. And I'm just going to follow up on what you said with regard to Katowice and COP24 and the enormous contribution of Sir David Attenborough to the discussion. And I think someone of his statute and someone like him has a huge ability to influence. And if you could please roll him out as often as possible and engage someone like that in this whole area, because I think he too, like you, Lord Devon, that when he spoke, it went worldwide and it was global, and it really did have impact to the extent that it brought tears to my eyes because it was so stark. I have a number of questions for you. With regard to the land use report, you went into some detail around re-wetting and restoring peatlands. And I wanted to ask you, because that's an area we've discussed here at length, and what incentives you use to do that, and have you regulation around it, and is it involved, is there any tax mechanism that is supporting the re-wetting and restoring of the bogs? That's a first question, or the peatlands.
Well, first of all, thank you for the comments about Lord Attenborough. I think there's another reason by David Attenborough. There's a good reason for talking about him in any case, because he's very encouraging for those of us who are slightly older. Because if you can still go on doing like he does at his age, it means I've got a long time to go. So I'm very keen on that. But also, he does have a voice which is listened to, and Katowice was much more successful than any of us dared hope, because in Poland with Mr. Trump it was, we thought, bound to be a disaster, and it wasn't, which is very important. At the moment, the peatlands arrangements are all done within our environmental support system. It's part of that. We're going to have to do much more about it, and we've got some real issues about planting, which we've also got to sort out. So there's quite a lot of work to be done in that area. The Secretary of State for DEFRA, who's responsible for it, Michael Gove, with whom I disagree on almost everything except this, he does seem to have got hold of this whole issue of the environment in a remarkably intelligent and driving way. He's just produced a document on waste yesterday, which is really worth your committee looking at, because it's it is very significant, and I think goes very much further than most of us would have thought it would have done. So, we will be pressing for more work to be done, and of course it is one of the issues that Ireland has a special need to deal with. I mean, peat is a very, very serious area of damage, and Ireland, I'm afraid, has historically done things there which it shouldn't have done, and we know that, and we all know that, so there's no point in disagreeing with it. That's what happened, and therefore the replacement and the attempt to make up and repair that damage is a really important one. And it's one of the pressures which Ireland could bring onto the European Union. It's why I'm a passionate European. I just think that this is the sort of thing that the whole community ought to be helping with. And very often the whole community ought to help us with making up for the sins of the past. This is one of them, and I think we ought to try to get... And that's one of the reasons why the common agricultural policy does need real reform, because it was created, just like deficiency payments in Britain before, it was created in order to make sure we had enough food to eat. And that's not what the purpose of it should be today. It should be to enable farmers and land users to move from where they are to where they have to be in the context of climate change. And so that's going to be a big battle. And Ireland has a special role to play, because you're an agricultural country, but you are one that recognises that in the end, rather less than in the end, in the immediate future, we've got to do something about it. And Ireland has tended not to be on that side, but is increasingly moving to that side. So you've got a very big role to play, I think.
And the report you referred to, Michael Gove, it was on waste, was it?
Yes, it's called, I've forgotten what it's called, but it was the waste report produced yesterday by DEFRA.
And does that include food waste? Or?
It's about food waste, and one of the things that's fascinating is that we never thought he'd do it, but he is going to insist that there should be compulsory food waste collection in every part of the United Kingdom. I mean, so that to me was the big breakthrough. Yeah. We've been pressing for it and arguing it, but and that we will use it for anaerobic digestion and composting.
Okay. Are you planning to do more reports like the land use reports around agriculture or transport?
Well, we have we have a second report on the land use one. This was the preliminary one that we have done, trying to clear the ground, and I'm sorry, that was a bit of a pun, I didn't mean that, but trying to make it clear what we were going to deal with, and then we followed that with a second one, which we will do next year, this time next year. We have an aviation report, which is relatively imminent, and the Department of Transport has produced the preliminary bit of its own report, then we put some more in, then so far they've moved in the right direction, so we've got to push it a bit further in that direction. And then, of course, our key report sometime about the, it's very difficult to know quite how long it'll take us, but sometime late spring, probably, we will produce a report in response to the government's request that we should say how we ought to move towards net zero. And that's going to be a very difficult report because, first of all, we've got to define what we mean by net zero. Do we mean net zero GHG? Do we need net zero carbon? So we've got to define that, and then we've got to express how that might be done. And that's what we're working on now.
Where else? Yes. Do you have microgeneration, so households with solar, wind capacity to produce and to feed into the grid in the UK?
Yes, we do. And the system has been very successful. It's also exposed the problem, which is that if you are one of the longest standing countries with a grid system, it was not built for this. It was built for big generating centres. And of course, there are still people who hanker after it. I think I was teased my colleagues, Conservative Party, that they like big things that they build and look at it and point at it. And somehow or other they feel that windmills are a sort of bit fairy, it's a bit sort of, not really there, sort of slightly. And the great achievement of offshore wind is that we have actually shown that this is not a sort of joke system of people who really aren't very practical. This is now, next to onshore wind, the cheapest way of producing electricity. It's an amazing achievement. And I do think sometimes we ought to remind ourselves of how far we've gone in the last 10 years. I mean, it is amazing. Nobody would have thought that we could have moved as far as we have already, which is why when you talked, Mr Neville and Mr Daly, about farming, I mean, yes, it's very tough and it's very difficult, but we have to recognise how much you can do. And you go back 10 years and nobody thought that United Kingdom would actually end up with all these wind farms outside, become the leader in wind technology, all that. Nobody would have believed it. So similarly, I think today, nobody would believe that Ireland could be the leader in how you change land use, both in peat terms and in agriculture terms, around the world.
Yeah, but also in terms of wind, I have loads more questions.
Well, I'm sorry, you only have 5 minutes. I've given you at least 15. So.
No, just specifically on the wind, because Ireland has tremendous potential. I mean, one of the barriers to entry for us in this area is our legislation. It's blocking that capacity to develop that area. Like, how did you get around that?
Well, we got around it, I suppose, because the campaigners against wind onshore made a great fuss about saying, well, we ought to have wind offshore. So we said, yes, all right, that's what you want, that's what we'll have to do. And I had a lot of that in my own constituency, because they didn't want land, they didn't want onshore, they wanted it offshore, because they didn't want it onshore. So we've now got it offshore in very big quantities. Now they're complaining about the fact that if it's offshore, you've actually got to bring the electricity onshore, so you've got to build something to put it into. So there's, I mean, it's not easy, there's this whole game. The thing that is, we've just got to get over the problem. Onshore electricity, onshore wind, is now the cheapest way of producing electricity. And I think governments have got to be frank with people. And you have to say, if you don't have windmills, you have more expensive electricity. Your bills are going to be higher. And frankly, it's surprising how people begin to change if you do that. The second thing you have to do, and which Britain didn't do, and which I think Ireland could do, is that you've got to ensure that the locality that has the windmill gets some of the advantages, so that it's worth its while. That's why the Germans have been so successful, because 50% of their wind is owned by local communities, local cooperatives. So you've 3 windmills up on that hill there. You know your electricity is significantly cheaper, if not free, because you get that as your payment for giving to the community that opportunity. The third thing we have to remember is that once you put the windmills up, it's surprising how people who didn't like them before begin to like them. Now, in the nearest town to me, and I live in the country, I am a countryman, this is, you know, up the road is the little town of Eye. Very small town, very historic, and they've got 3 windmills. And they hated it. They were so angry about it that planning permission was got, the rest of it. Now it's part of the scene. Now they have, we had, for example, a wonderful local rendition of a ballet, and they had it in 3 places, and the third one was out on the sward, in order to have these things as the sun went down, because they are seen as something quite different now. So don't forget that.
Senator Marshall.
Lord Devon, Chris, pleasure to have you here. It's interesting because you make continual reference to science and to policy and the importance of that. And it's interesting, just your last point to Senator O'Sullivan. I listened to a Radio 4 interview one day with a German farmer, and he was asked about why wind turbine and wind generation was deemed as being successful, much more successful in Germany than it was in the UK or Ireland. And his point was that when he looked out his kitchen window, that the turbine he saw was his turbine and not someone else's. And it was a key point that he made. I think when we look at agriculture and transport as portrayed as the big villains of the piece, we often forget the potential solutions that agriculture can present in our attempt to mitigate the climate change. When we look at this, I always think that we need to take this in a completely holistic approach, because there is not one bullet that will solve all our problems. And from my background, I actually farm in Northern Ireland. I work in Queen's University in the Institute of Global Food Security. So when we look at where that was born, if that was born out of the food fraud, the horsemeat scandal in the UK, the integrity and food security issues, we spend our time looking at agriculture, food, health and nutrition. We look at things like food waste, carbon footprint of agriculture, the food integrity. We look at things that the reality at the moment where we are, that there's more people die in the world because of obesity than die of starvation, and that's obscene. But my point is that everything we look at, we underpin with science. We substantiate, we validate it, we underpin it with science. And I was interested to hear your discussion on fracking, because it's an interesting perspective. When I look at this committee and I look at government and the function of government, and my experience both in Northern Ireland, the UK and in Dublin, I see a position where politicians have a 4 or 5 year term from election to election, which you need to make an impact, you need to make a difference and be seen to be doing the right things if you ultimately want to be re-elected. My concern is that in that, and in the court of public opinion, in the court of the media, and populist opinion, that sometimes we can make decisions that are knee-jerk reactions now under pressure that actually will have impact 10, 20, 50 years in the future, which may actually have completely unintended consequences. On the basis of that, I'd like to hear your opinion on where we are with evidence-based policy making, because government, in my opinion, needs the support of evidence-based policy making, something that's underpinned with science and fact, and not sentiment and emotion and what's popular at a point in time. Because, you know, we look at the mitigation and the adaptation objectives, we look at the strategies, and we look at the land use policy. It's critically important that we base this on fact and says, where are you on that? And I suppose my second and final question is, it's on your point about the current report. Yesterday, Michael Gove's report on waste. And you know, we're working with the company. It's a UK company where it's about accelerated aerobic digestion, and in 24 hours you can turn food waste into effectively a product that will generate power of CHP power plant, produce heat and electricity. So science can offer some solutions and some answers to some of these problems. But I'm just interested to hear your opinion on government policy and evidence-based policy.
Well, you're quite right. I mean, this is what I tried to say about the two timetables, the political timetable of the mandate, 4 or 5 years, and the climate change timetable, which is a continuous battle in order to win the war. And politicians are very concerned about their impact immediately, and that's a perfectly understandable thing. Science-based is really important, and I think that the United Kingdom government has improved considerably in its listening to science. I don't think it was anything like as good there 20 years ago. You know, when I was a minister, I don't think it was anything like as good at listening to it, except in specific areas. But it is difficult. Particularly because there's always a tendency to find some rogue scientists who've got a different view from what the general thing is. And also because some of the conclusions are really very unsettling. Now, your university, your Vice-Chancellor has been the leader in food safety, and a man of huge strength, in my view. We relied on him enormously, and thoroughly nice man too, so I'm very much in favour. What science tells us about what we ought to do as far as diet is concerned is largely ignored. And if you look at the United Kingdom government trying to deal with obesity, I mean, it is absolutely, unbelievably unable to come to the tough terms. It's always good at telling other people what to do, but it's not doing it in the National Health Service, it's not doing it in all sorts of areas, even though the science is so clear. So you're quite right. It's better than it was. It's got to get better. And so many of the things that we're asking for in climate, for climate reasons, have got other important advantages too. I mean, we were talking in the taxi coming here, Chris and I, about the issue about fertility in the soil. Not only do we have to get back fertility in the soil so that it can sequester carbon, but we need to get it back because at the moment the fact is it is so diminished, not just in the United Kingdom but elsewhere too, that the trace elements in the vegetables and fruit that we're supposed to be eating our 5 a day with are not as good as they were. And we need to improve the fertility in order that they will actually hand on what we need to do. So and the same about obesity and the amount of meat we're eating and all those things, they come together. So I think that is important. Lastly, science is, unless we get the science right, we have no claim on the public. This is not a matter of opinion or campaigning. That's why I have to be really tough about the difference between the Climate Change Committee and the NGOs. And indeed, very often I disagree with the NGOs because I've got to keep the science right. And in a sense, the fact that I'm not a scientist is helpful because I ask the difficult questions. I mean, in other words, the stupid questions. It's very helpful. You say, well, what do you mean by that? On a platform, how would I explain that bit of science? And I think one of the things we have to say to scientists are that they really aren't always very good at explaining what they mean by things. And we have to be, politicians have got a really important role here to get scientists to speak a language which, it's not just that it's comprehensible, but resonates with the public, that's got a connection with the way people live, and very often they don't do that. So we want to try to do that. And one of the problems is, and why I think that here in Ireland you have a very special role to play, is that the north of Ireland has not been as good as the rest of the United Kingdom. Scotland is doing best, Wales is doing second best, England is doing third, but I'm afraid the north of Ireland has not done well. And that's partly because there are still people in politics in the north of Ireland who don't believe climate change is happening. They're the same people who think the world was created 86,000 years ago, but they are. But there is a real problem there, and you've got to show it. Ireland has done a great deal for encouraging the North of Ireland to understand the realities of the world, and I think it's a tremendously important thing here that you help. This is a cooperative matter, and together you can do an enormous amount of work. And I finish with this, but it seems to me that one of the great advantages we have with climate change is that it isn't the old argument. It's why we've got the Church of England and the Catholic Church to work together on these issues, because there's no history of argument. We never fell out on this. So Catholics like me can sit together with people who have a different view, and we can do a lot of these things. And I think the same is true about the North and the South, that it is possible to do some work here because there's very little baggage. And so we have to try very hard.
My apologies, I have to leave now, but can I just record my gratitude to Lord Eamon and
Thank you,
Mr. Stark for being here.
Thank you. Senator Marshall, are you finished with your
Yes,
question?
thank you.
Thanks very much. Can I ask a couple of questions on my own
please.
behalf? Thank you, Lord Denham. Just wondering, who funds your Climate Change Committee?
Well, it's funded by the, most of it comes from the business department's vote. Part of it comes from DEFRA's vote, that's the Department of Agriculture and Rural Affairs. We have specific money that comes for the work that we do quite separately, because we are employed by Scotland, the devolved government in Scotland, and by the government in Wales, and we have specific money from that. And then we can bid for money when people ask us to do more. And when we say, for example, we turned to DEFRA and said, you can't do your work, nor can we do our work unless we have some serious work on land use. And that's going to cost a significant amount of money, and we're going to have more people to do that. And that's what I meant about the fact is that we got the money, and we have been extremely well treated, frankly, by government on this, but it might be that we wouldn't be, which is why I would like to have a system whereby, as I say, you had an independent authority to whom you could turn and say, under the Act, we are supposed to give this advice, we can't do it unless we have this sort of budget. We've never had to worry about that. If we ever did, I think I would have to turn to the public and say, if you want this job done properly, either the government pays for it or we'll have to find some independently. And I'd be quite surprised if the Treasury wouldn't turn around and pay then, because the last thing they want is us to have an independent source of income.
Indeed. And I listened with interest in your commentary on the BBC and communicating it, and it's something that's exercised us quite a bit at this committee in terms of the role that in our case, RT, the state broadcaster, has, and indeed what the Meteorological Service has in communicating to people. What has the Meteorological Service in the UK done in terms of getting the accurate information out to people?
Well, it's been extremely helpful because, of course, it's been able to draw on, as far as Britain is concerned, probably the leading meteorological service in the world, used by the United States, I may say, rather than its own meteorological service in a number of areas. So it's been used. It's been able to use that very, very distinct scientific quality to be able to support the science in an effective way. The previous head of the Meteorological Office, a woman, Julia Slingo, had a very determined effect. Sometimes comes, if I may dare say this, better from a woman who gets up there and says it in that sort of way. She was a surprising success, and earned particular attack from Lord Lawson, I have to say, because she did it so well. So they have been very helpful.
Okay, very good. And the other thing I wanted to ask you about is the CCS technology. What are your views on that?
Well, I don't think we can do what we need to do without carbon capture and storage. I think it's a silly argument about whether it should be carbon capture and usage or carbon capture and storage. I mean, the fact is we don't have the uses that we would need to have to make it really worthwhile. We've just got to be able to store carbon, because there's a great gap otherwise which we can't fill in all our targets, which is why we are pleased that the government has finally understood that that really has to be done, and that unless we get it, the only alternatives are hugely more expensive. And therefore we've got to do this. And there's no reason why the United Kingdom couldn't be a leader in it, because we have the advantages of holes down which to put it, if you see what I mean. I mean, it's a sort of post-fossil fuel situation that we have. And the places where we can't do it are really very difficult. We've been trying to work now with the Welsh Government, for example, because their problem is that their biggest emitters are all in that south corner of Wales, where there isn't a natural place to store the carbon. So there is an issue there, but it is crucial.
Okay. And we, of course, are considering carbon tax, another recommendation of the Citizens' Assembly. Have you considered the fee and dividend model of carbon taxation? Because I don't think you went down that route, did you, in the UK?
Well, of course, we've considered all sorts of things amongst ourselves, but in a sense, we eschew having comments on taxation systems, because our job is to fix the outcome. And we have to prove that that is possible within the present context. So what we would do would be to say perhaps that, well, if you increase the speed of switch to electric cars, if you do more about land use, if you do this, put those together and you can reach this, or you might do a whole series of other things and reach this. Government must decide it. I can conceive of situations in which we might suggest the government ought to look at the taxation system in particular ways. But the problem with us doing that is that in the end we have to be practical, and we don't know what the result of a particular tax would be. And in a sense, it is genuinely where government should be acting. The taxation system is in the end the role, the prime role in many ways, of government. They must make that decision. All we would do would be to say among our scenarios there is a possibility of decreasing the use of fossil fuels by a different taxation. I can imagine doing that, but we wouldn't go further than that.
And in terms of your successes to date, what do you think you've been most successful at to date, in terms of policy recommendations or? Well,
I think the fact that the government, we managed to convince the government that it should allow £7.6 billion to be spent on transforming the electricity system must be an absolutely huge thing. And to get a Conservative Chancellor in a very tough time to do that and defend it right the way through was hugely important, despite the attacks by newspapers and such like on what they thought was green taxes and the rest. Now, I think the second was connected with that, which is then the Climate Change Committee realised that nobody listened to us when we talked about the price of energy. Nobody listened to us because nobody understood what a kilowatt hour was, leave alone how much per kilowatt hour it was. And we were the ones who decided to talk about bills, what people actually paid. And that enabled us to show that the effect of the measures that we'd taken was lowering the amount of electricity that people needed. Because if they had new boilers or they had new toasters or the rest of it, they all used less electricity. So we were able to say what was absolute clincher, which was to say, yes, you're paying about £9 a month more than you would otherwise pay for the green measures. But your bills are £20 a month less because you're using less electricity. So you're in for 11 quid a month on that basis. Now, for the first time, there was a connection with what people understood with what we were actually doing. And I put that down as one of our real triumphs of communication. And one of the reasons I say that is it annoyed the doubters enormously. They were so angry because it got rid of their only real argument, which was a pretty pathetic one, but it was that, you know, we were laying all these weight on the poor, and the poor were having to pay for it, and you know, that was like, actually the poor were actually benefiting significantly from this, even though our system in the United Kingdom is not, I think, as sensitive to the to deprivation as it should be.
And how do you maintain the cross-party support for your committee?
Well, first of all, we started well. It's very important. The science becomes more and more clear, and people's experience of climate change becomes greater, and it is more difficult to defend the opposite line. I think we have to accept that too. And the third thing is, we are very, very tough about not becoming party political. And part of the reason for that is, in a sense, I'm lucky about that because they know that I have been a politician all my life, so they know that I understand that, and that I have to keep my independence very clear, because it would be very easy to make points as somebody who sits as a Conservative in the House of Lords. But the bit that has been very effective, really, is that we have really clamped down on anybody who tries to use climate as a party political operation. We've been really tough about that. And part of the reason for that is that, as a politician, I know that it is very much easier to be green in opposition. All parties are greener in opposition than they are in government, because in opposition you don't have the pressures of how do you deliver electricity next week, and what about this march all that doesn't happen to you. So we are very careful to not to, and we get, the only time I really speak politically is to object when a party of any kind tries to use climate as a differentiating thing, except in the sense of wanting to go further than the government. I'm all for them doing that. That's a very good thing, but not to use it as a party political weapon.
And have you had occasion to threaten the law on anybody to date?
No, I have actually had a time at the election before last, when I had just become chairman. The Conservative Party put out an entirely incorrect statement, which they had copied from a particularly ill-named and mischievous organisation called the Taxpayers Alliance, which appears to be allied with nobody and not represent taxpayers. It seems to be me to represent people who don't want to pay tax rather than Taxpayers Alliance. But they had produced some quite fictitious figures on the cost of energy. And I did have to say publicly that the Tory party was quite wrong to use it, and that it was unacceptable. Which is quite convenient, because it means now that if I say it about any other party, nobody thinks that I'm being partial. But that's the only time.
Okay. And in terms of the carbon budgets that you set, how effective have they been across the various sectors? I mean, obviously you're successful in the renewables. What about transport, heavy industry?
Well, of course, in total, they have been successful. The government has met first and second and probably the third. It's not going to meet the fourth and the fifth unless it makes some very big changes, and we have to press that very hard. As I said, it's been spectacularly more successful in electricity generation, but then that was necessary because you can't do the other things. No point having electric cars if they're using fossil fuel energy, so you've actually got to do that in order. I think it is very arguable that the fact that we're flatlining in general and not going up has been a success. It's not successfully enough, but it has been a success. I think we have to say that. And the fact that the budgets are there mean that we have, for example, had this very week. I mean, yesterday, the Department of Transport produced its first aviation report, and in it has accepted the restrictions which the Climate Change Committee has placed on it. Whereas previously there was a bit of iffy, not quite, that kind of thing, but it's now there. So I think we are being successful, but we come back to the point that I made, Mr. Marshall, to you, which is that this is all about urgency. I mean, the comment that we had with your neighbour when we talked about the campaigners. I mean, we ought to be very worried about how slow all this is and how much has to be done and how we all have to do it and how we do have to say to people the one argument that is unacceptable is that I can't do it because somebody else will take my place. Because if we do that, if we're in the after you Claude world, we will not solve this problem.
Very good. Did you want to come back in again, Senator Sullivan?
The use of technology, smart metering, is that rolled out in all houses in the UK?
Well, we're rolling out smart metering pretty rapidly. There are always arguments about it and whether we've got the right sort. And one of the problems with smart metering is rather like, do you remember when we started to have laptops? There were some people who never actually got a laptop because there was always another laptop which was going to be better than the one that they could. So they don't buy this one. So they left it until right at the end of the scope because they would never settle on something. So there's a bit of a problem like that with smart metering, but no, we're using that. And there's lots of technology that can... I mean, for example, I meant to say, but the Irish have been wonderful because they've invented this fantastic system whereby you keep the chickens, you organise the chickens, and then when you collect the shit, you then use that to produce the energy for the next lot of chickens, and actually you only use about 50% of it. You've got 50% to put into the grid. So I mean that is an Irish invention. We did some before I joined the Climate Change Committee. We did some work for them. We wouldn't be able to do that now, but we did the work then, and I'm absolutely enthusiastic about those sort of. Very often it's these exciting things that come in left field in technology that really you think. There's a man who's just done some work on turbulence and has shown how you can be 60% more accurate in seeing with the turbulence in an aeroplane. So it means the aeroplane doesn't have to move so far when it wants to escape turbulence because it knows it's there. So you reduce the amount of energy that you use in the aeroplane because you don't need so much fuel. Because you don't have to go very high up because you know precisely where it is and you can do that. I think that's a fantastic piece which none of us expected. Isn't on the list of things that are going to reduce the emissions of airplanes.
Do you benchmark against any other country? So have you a role model in terms of a country?
Well, frankly, we use any country that's doing better than us to say, why can't we do it as well as that? And we do benchmark against each bit of the United Kingdom. I mean, we're absolutely adamant to say to the English government, so to speak, the Scots are doing so much better. I mean, the Welsh are doing much better on waste. And this document produced on waste by DEFRA is partly as good as it is because we kept on saying, you really don't want the Welsh to beat you, which we enjoyed.
And have you incentivised organic farming in view of what you say around soil fertility and land use?
Well, no, we haven't. I mean, when I was minister, I laid down the rules which made sure that organic farming was genuinely organic, that organic production was organic and not fraud, which sometimes it can be. I mean, I think there are, I don't think that actually we are asking organic farming. We're talking about extensive farming, and there are a lot of bits in the organic argument which I think scientifically I find very difficult to take. I mean, I don't understand why it should be right to use, for example, copper sulfate, but not right to have potassium. I don't see that their rules about a number of things make sense. But I do have very strong views about the remarkable fact by the woman who was much the leader of it, because what she did was to make people respect the soil. The whole concept of the soil association, even though I don't accept the organic argument, but I do accept this fundamental view that the soil is important and that we have misused it. And I come back to the Pope's comments about that. I mean, it is this misuse through greed that has put us in the position in which we are. And the soil which we should have been protecting and looking after, we've allowed to be very much diminished because we have misused it. And she was right.
Thank you. Any other questions? Can I just say thank you so much, Lord Deebham and Chris Stark, for coming before us this afternoon. I think it's been a very worthwhile engagement for us, and I really appreciate you taking the time to travel over here, especially to share your views and experiences with us. So, as there's no other business, the meeting of the Joint Committee is adjourned until the 16th of January 2019. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.